Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Casual Criminalist. As always, I'm your host. Today, the Kyoto Animation Massacre, written by George, read by me. That is the format of the show. If you're new here, I've never read this before. We're going to explore it together, dear audience. Thanks for being here. Let's jump in. It's a long one, by the way. George has been busy. Question for you folks. If I were to ask you to take a moment to think of the most atrocious criminal that you're familiar with, both from this channel and just generally, what would spring to mind? Look, small scale, relatively, Pedro Lopez, the guy who murdered all the children. And I say small scale, he murdered like 200. And then we think large scale, in the modern era, I get Osama bin Laden, architect 9/11, Adolf Hitler back in the 20th century. You know, these guys were, they're pretty atrocious criminals. Certainly, and indeed tragically, we aren't exactly lacking for choices. As just in my own back catalogue, we find loathsome sorts such as Lam Kor Wan, Hong Kong's most notorious serial killer, Iftikhar Ahmed, a Brit who murdered his own daughter, and the 2017 Las Vegas mass shooter, whose name I still refuse to utter. Best that way. Like, I think, you know, these people, they maybe want some kind of like sick fame or infamy, more accurately, and I don't think we should give it to them. We should just refer to them as, I don't know, Los Angeles shooter knobface. Something like that. Oh, I'm drinking a cup of Gamer Subs, which you can get and you can support the show by going to... I'm looking at my link. gamersubs.gg/TCC. It's cheap, it's delicious, it contains caffeine to keep me juiced up to get through these beastie scripts like that George likes to write for me. And I'd recommend it. gamersubs.gg/TCC. Thank you. Today, however, I may have just happened upon the most reprehensible one yet. A Japanese man who back in 2019 took 40 litres of petrol to Kyoto Animation. That's not a lot of petrol. Is it? Is that enough to cause like a massive blaze? A popular and highly successful anime studio based in its titular city set it alight and in the space of mere moments killed 36 people, wounded a further 33, and left just a single uninjured survivor. Wait, so he set fire to it? So I'm assuming he set the building on fire. Part of that's got to go down to like, how the hell did you not have an escape plan? Or like, you know, fire exits? I'll say this outright. No case I've written about has ever emotionally devastated me quite like this one. Oh my god. How could this compare to Pedro Lopez? He like sexually assaulted in the most grievous ways and murdered 200 children. I mean, this guy burned down a building with people inside. It is tacky to rate atrocities. But Pedro Lopez, my guys. It's a case where there is no heroic and tireless policing in the aftermath. I like that, though. No silver-lined sub-narratives and no comfort in its resolution. Only a profound tragedy that leaves you but a hollowed-out and emotionally fragile husk of what you once were. Brilliant way to start my Tuesday morning, George. Thank you. This is also why I opted against doing my usual highly dramatized and adrenaline-pumping style of introduction. For a case such as this, extreme as it is in its horror, it just simply doesn't feel appropriate. Call me an overthinker, I guess, as I suspect you'd likely be correct. And so, with that said, let's take a big breath to steel ourselves and begin the story of the Kyoto Animation arson attack. I don't know how this is going to rattle me so hard. Like, I don't see how this could rattle me like Pedro Lopez, which it was over a year ago and I still think about that. Chapter 1. The Attack. The attacker, who I shall call Zako, first arrived at the scene of the massacre, Kyoto's Animation Studio 1, on the 15th of July, a whole 3 days before his attack, having withdrawn 57,000 yen, or around $350 from his bank account, and hidden 6 knives about his person. Seems excessive. And upon hearing that, I know full well what many of you be thinking, that he must have gotten there nice and early to fully prepare and plan out his wicked deed. But while such an assumption would certainly be understandable given the absolutely horrific death toll he wrought, that does not appear to be the case at all, because while he was hanging around Kyoto Animation a lot, as in from sun up to sundown, he actually did not appear to be proactively planning. Okay, so he's obsessed with it, or someone in it, right? With witness testimony speaking of how he was simply loitering aimlessly outside the studio, his eyes still and vacant, as if looking at absolutely nothing at all, and yet directionally at least, being aimed right at the studio. Maybe he's mentally unwell? Well, lots going on here so far. And it was a sight that only got increasingly bizarre as the days rolled on, because he hadn't brought a spare set of clothes with him. Consequently, every day his red t-shirt would become a touch more sweat-stained, and his stone-washed jeans a tad more dirty. Wait, is he just staying there permanently? He clearly wasn't washing too, as his heavy-set face also became all the more grubby, with the hair atop it increasingly disheveled as time went on. I assume this is from security camera footage later, right? His ever more revolting appearance is actually why his actions in the run-up to the attack are remembered so well. You see, folks, I don't know if you know this, but us anime fans, that's George, not me, I know nothing about anime, at our very worst, aren't exactly what you'd call personable and animal. Some of us can actually be rather socially awkward, and so Kyoto Animation has gotten quite used to, how do you put it, unusual displays of affection at its door. I've met George. George came to Prague and we had dinner together. And I don't know, George is not how you would, like, the way he describes it here, you kind of imagine George as like this nerdy anime fan. George is not that. This is quite contradictory to my experience of George. Therefore, for a time, Zako loitering was simply marked up as another one of those well-meaning but rather awkward fans, and so he caused no concern. However, hanging around for days at a time, barely moving, never changing clothes or washing, that was just really fucking weird, and there was no two ways about it. So as soon as people started to properly keep an eye on him, with one survivor of the fire even likening his behavior to being on a pilgrimage of sorts, clearly in a place of great reverence to him, and yet fully retreated into his own mind. He doesn't seem well, does he? He didn't stay outside, or once the staff had gone home, however, with him first checking into a local hotel under his real name, and maybe, because my sources really are not consistent on this point, also staying in a 24-hour internet cafe near Kyoto's main station on other nights. Eventually, however, the loitering and weird pre-massacre pilgrimage came to an end, and Zako was ready to put his plan into action on the morning of the 18th. First, he had to gather his supplies, an endeavor for which he made 2 stops. The first took him to a shopping center a couple hundred meters north of Studio One, from which he purchased 2 20-liter jerry cans and a lump hammer. Don't know what a lump hammer is, I assume it's some sort of hammer, as well as a little cart to carry them. It's only 40 kilos, dude. 20 kilos? I guess that is quite a lot, actually. 20 kilos in each hand would be a lot. This was only a couple of hundred meters from Studio One, only to the west, which meant he had to double back on himself, and so he took the opportunity to store his hammer and knives down the alley that ran beside his target. Naturally, when he got to the petrol station, he also attracted some curiosity from the attendant on duty. I mean, 1 jerry can, sure, people run out of go juice in the car, and people have various petrol-powered things in their garden, so it's totally normal to be filling one of these up. But 2, that was all the more peculiar, so quite understandably, while making all the usual small talk with the customer, the attendant surrendered to his curiosity and asked what the petrol was in aid of. Not that he was suspicious, mind you, it's just nosy. Yeah, I'd be curious. But also, I don't know, I could see myself needing to fill up 2 jerry cans. I go on like big road trips. I got like a car for going off-road and stuff. And sometimes you just want to get some extra petrol and strap it to the roof, just in case you want to go real long. Because 40 litres is a good amount of go juice. It'll get you quite far. Just as quickly as the curious eyebrow had been raised, it was lowered once again as Zako brushed it off by explaining that he had a big generator that he needed to keep juiced up. Ah, that'd do it, the attendant thought. And that was the end of that. Zako was now fully tooled up with everything he could possibly need to execute his foul and loathsome plan. It would take him a little under half an hour to make the 200-meter walk back to Studio One, with him having finished at the petrol station a little after 10 a.m. Why so long, you ask? Well, partly that was because he was pathetically idle and unfit, so the mere physical task of pulling 30 kilos of fuel in a... Wait, 30 kilos? 2 20-litre jerry cans? Petrol weighs about the same as water? Shouldn't that be 40 kilos? Maybe I'm wrong about the weight of petrol, but I really thought it was about 1 kilo a litre. In a handy little cart, 200 metres down a perfectly flat bit of road was nothing short of an Olympian task for him. But further to just that, the closer to the studio he got, the more that bizarrely calm demeanour he had displayed while stalking the studio and making excuses at the petrol station began to evaporate, leaving in its place an ever more erratic and jumpy one, which didn't do wonders for his pace. This guy, if it was only 30 kilos... I'm pretty sure I could do that faster than him without a cart. In fact, CCTV footage of his approach to Studio One was eventually shown in court as evidence. Oh, okay, so he survives. I kind of assumed that the reason there's no satisfactory ending here, because they have the death penalty in Japan, is because he died in the fire or some such. So there does seem to be some closure to Day George. I'm very curious how this is going to rattle me so hard. It continues. I'm sure at the end of this episode I'll be like, well, that was horrible. And while it has never been shown publicly, the footage of his approach, that is, one person who did see the footage spoke publicly about how utterly bizarre the transformation was. Utterly calm and collected at the petrol station, to visibly and physically ticking on his final approach to Studio One. And do you want to know something soul-destroying, folks? I mean, not really, George, but I guess that's where we're going. Had the loathsome little urchin come to launch his attack on any other day, the story would likely have ended there, as he would have found the entrance to Studio One firmly locked, with a couple of heavies on the other side of it, who would have seen an erratic fellow with loads of petrol trying to get in, called the police, and then raced outside to give him a right and proper shoeing before he could do anything stupid. Yeah, this makes sense that if this studio has weird fans hanging around outside, that they would have security. I think that makes a lot of sense. But tragically, instead of attempting it on those days, he had to pick the 18th, didn't he? When the electric lock that normally clamped the main door firmly shut was deactivated for the arrival of some very important visitors who were due to arrive a little later on, so he slipped right in. When inside, Zako found himself a demon masquerading in the form of a man, as without hesitation he immediately leapt upon his jerry cans, yanked one clean out of his trolley, and began shakily tearing at the lid until it came loose. Then, with the unmistakable smell of petrol beginning to permeate the air of Studio One's reception, Zako, over and over again at a volume barely louder than a whisper, began muttering, "Die, die, die, die." And that was all he said, over and over again. That same foreboding word. Die, 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 die. From there, with his proclamation of doom getting ever louder, he began pouring petrol on everything that was forthcoming, the floors, the walls, the furniture, and even some of the employees. I was wondering where everyone was, as a small group of them had raced over to try and get a handle on what the hell was going on. And still, all the while, Zako just kept repeating that word, with him now screaming it as intensely as his lungs would allow. Can't we just bundle onto him at this point? Like, just take him outside, because then there's going to be petrol everywhere, but without evacuate the building, but without an ignition source, nothing's going to happen. Bundle onto him and get him outside. Get him away from the fire that he's trying to set. The workers who had come out to intercept Zako were no fools, and they immediately knew there was only one way the situation was going to end if they didn't put an end to it immediately, and so a ferocious melee ensued. Well, okay, good. Isn't it going to be like many against one? Surely, and this guy seems very unfit. The court papers, which saw the incident play out on recovered CCTV footage, speak of this moment intently, of how the workers fought like lions to try and subdue the maniac before them, growing ever more frantic in their efforts as Zako kept on pushing them away and leaping back upon his jerry can. And when he couldn't do that, in the brief moments where the workers managed to tip the scales against him, he would thrash out towards it with any limb that was available, his leg, his arm, his neck even. It mattered not. Anything he could do to knock that can and splash even a drop more fuel, he did. And of course, while doing this, he kept on screaming that word over and over again. Okay, so he's got that like psycho superpower, you know, where someone's just like absolutely mad and they've got some sort of like they don't care if they hurt their own body when they're fighting. It kind of overrides that self-protection thing, and just that's why he's fighting so many people despite not being very fit, I figure. Then at 10:31 a.m., with either a full jerry can empty or his feeling that he was about to be overpowered to a point where he couldn't recover, it's hard to tell which from available sources, Zako felt the time had come, and so, when able, he momentarily broke free of the now rather sizable cohort of workers that was restraining him, pulled a disposable lighter from his pocket, and sparked the flint. These guys, you've got to bundle him! Go, go, go! The immediate scene was one of total and complete devastation. The few moments that Zako had been frantically pouring petrol everywhere had been just about long enough for the petrol to begin evaporating. Meaning that a small layer of vaporized petrol hung all over the floor and furnishings, what with it being heavier than air. Sparking the flint caused this layer to ignite immediately, creating an initial flash fire that ignited all the petrol in the blink of an eye. So bad was it, in fact, that it even caused an explosion of sorts, as the petrol concentration was so high and confined within such a small space that it created what's called a sudden overpressure, i.e. a small blast effect. From there, it took a mere 30 seconds for the entirety of Studio One to be engulfed in flames, with the raging fire tearing down a hallway that led out of reception, where it then found its way into a spiral staircase that took it right up to the third floor on top. And of course, it also spread into every single room it passed along the way, and into the ones adjacent to them from there. God damn, 20 liters of petrol did this? It doesn't really seem like a lot of petrol, but I guess there's a lot of energy in petrol. And I really want to stress the whole 30-second detail, folks. Can you even begin to imagine such a situation? Try to picture it if you can. And I mean that quite literally. Close your eyes and picture now a point of view of yourself at work. You're sat there completely unaware of a brewing situation, not even 100 paces from where you sit, and then, alerted to something peculiar by the vaguely familiar and growing ever stronger smell of a fire in your nostrils, you turn your head to investigate just to see the doorway closest to you, and everything around it is on fire and spreading rapidly. Okay, take what I said back about the about not having a good fire plan or fire exits or whatever. I can't believe the fire can spread this quickly. It's kind of mad. What the do you do in that situation? Could you even do anything, or would you simply find yourself petrified on the spot, completely overwhelmed by this cataclysmic situation that has developed in the blink of an eye? I mean, I assume I'd look for a fire extinguisher, and then I'd look for an exit. Or I'd look for an exit, or I'd shut the door, and look for an alternative exit. If there wasn't an alternative exit, I'd look for a fire extinguisher. If there wasn't a fire extinguisher, yeah, then I'd probably get into just the straight-up panic mode. Even if you do find yourself able to muster a reaction of some kind, what do? You have less time to react than it took Simon to read this paragraph, and then the relentless flames are upon you. With 3 stories up max, right? I'd probably make that jump. I mean, I'd get terribly, terribly injured, but that versus getting burned alive, I'll take the jump. 3rd floor is high, though. You're really going to have some bad time on landing. As what the real people of Studio One did, many were simply consumed by the flames of their workstations, but others did bolt from the desks, relying purely on their instincts to see them right. Tragically, many of this latter group found themselves flanked by smoke on all sides, and then oxygen deprived and disorientated, they passed out and were soon enough taken by the flames. A lucky few even managed to get to the earlier mentioned spiral staircase in the few seconds they had before it was engulfed by flames. They made for the roof, which was intended to act as a last resort fire door, but the regulations that saw the building built in that manner hadn't been written with such a rapidly spreading fire in mind, so no, not one of them made it to the roof. For what it was worth at that point, the Kyoto City Fire Department had at least been made aware of the situation. Yeah, I mean, but goddamn, it's spreading so quickly. Even with an incredible response time, they're going to get there and it's going to be late. Is it not a fire suppression system or something? Well, I'm thinking in my office, I just have fire extinguishers. I don't have a fire suppression system. How modern is this building? It seems 3 stories. It's got a reception. I kind of feel like maybe it would have a fire suppression system. Or it should, at least. They had been informed almost immediately, in fact, as a local resident who lived barely 20 paces from Studio One had heard the initial overpressure explosion, and upon seeing the evidently rather terrible situation that was unfolding before him, he had raised the alarm. Tragically, however, the fire had spread so damn quickly that by the time that our unnamed local resident had shuffled off to investigate the explosion, seen what was going on, and then raced to his phone, the fire had already taken hold of half the building. I am just finding out. I know people are like, Simon, fire spreads, probably thinking like, fire spreads really fast, Simon. How do you not know this? And I'm like, I feel like I know fire spreads quickly, but I didn't quite realize it was this quickly. It's unbelievably fast. You're talking seconds, if you're lucky, minutes, not minutes, dozens of them. And further still, by the time it then gone to dial 119, which in Japan puts you straight through for a fire truck or ambulance, and then actually explain the situation, the whole building was engulfed. Yeah, that's something interesting. Like, in the UK, we just have 999, and it connects you to an emergency switchboard, and then they ask, which service do you need? Here, you could do that with 112, but you can also dial, there's specific numbers, like 158 for police, 155 for ambulance, and 15... Oh, I don't remember the fire department one. Maybe 6? I'm not sure. I just dial 112.
We are gonna die. I'm out of here.
Despite the crushing and unpreventable tragedy before them, however, the Kyoto City Fire Department specifically, and indeed the city's other emergency services more broadly, were flawless in their response. Every vehicle that could be spared was immediately dispatched, with 49 fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars all getting their right pedals planted to the floor as their occupants raced to the scene. The number would soon enough swell to 111 vehicles as on-call firefighters in Kyoto over-answered their pages and sprinted for their stations, and dispatch room staff scrambled to free up every asset possible. 111 vehicles! It's a 3-story building fire! Is an extra 100 over 11 going to make a difference? And with Fushimi Fire Station, Fushimi Police Station, and Kyoto Medical Center only being 1.5, 1.8, and 2 kilometers away respectively, it took mere minutes for the initial first responders to start turning up, with the Fushimi firefighters being the first on the scene at 10:40 a.m. For those firefighters, the situation that greeted them seemed to be simply insurmountable, as by now the modest little 3-story office block had quite evidently been all but totally consumed by the flames. It mattered not to them, however, as be it a pokey little bin fire or this, their response was the same: get in there immediately and rescue survivors. 6 of the Kyoto Animation staffers had already made it out of their own accord by this time. 4 of them had sprinted right through the flames and made for the front door the moment the fire started. Another had gotten out the moment he saw the lighter emerge from Zako's pocket, dodging the fire outright. Yeah, that's my guy. I mean, he's getting out that lighter. Time to stop bundling him and time to leave. And the final one had smashed a window on the second floor when they found themselves cut off by the flames and then taken a leap of faith onto the concrete below. Yep, that's my guy. That's what I would have done. For that person, the call was a good one, as while the fall didn't exactly do their bones any favours, it spared them from both the flames and the smoke, and they would go on to survive. Sadly, the same cannot be said for 4 who sprinted through the flames, as they were horrifically burned in the process thereof, and all but one of them would pass with time. Yeah, I feel broken bones way better than burns. Like, unless you're talking like spine, I think I'd take the jump than go through the flames. Because flames, burns, infection, death. Shockingly, however, and in quite the pleasant surprise for me, it has to be said, as the firefighters entered Studio 1 and pushed through the flames, they actually managed to find a few survivors still clinging to life and began pulling them out with all possible haste. 3 people, for example, who had taken refuge in a ground floor women's restroom, were found alive because they had retreated before Zako had managed to light the petrol. Through little circumstance but the grace of God, the bathroom happened to have quite the substantial and tight door, and this had kept the flames back long enough for the firefighters to come to the rescue, and they all survived. Another 3 survivors were also pulled from inside the building, although details concerning their rescue were not forthcoming. 25 people, with nowhere else to go, had also retreated to the second floor balcony. 20 of them were on the second floor when the fire broke out, and 5 of them had descended, somehow, from the third floor balcony above. And I say somehow because the news articles I'm using to piece this chapter together are really scant on details for how they achieved this. But achieve it, I don't doubt they did. Wait, so they climbed down from a third floor balcony to a second floor balcony? That doesn't seem impossible. Like, you just climb down on the outside and then swing yourself in, and you're probably going to get really horribly bruised. But I think you wouldn't even break a bone doing that. And if you did, worth it. Luckily, the firefighters had ladders up to the balcony no sooner than they were out of their trucks, and they were all off the balcony in no time, although again, some of them did succumb to their injuries down the line. Come 10:44 a.m., a total of 37 survivors had made it out, one way or another, and the paramedics in attendance began starting triage protocols, classifying them as red for those who were staring death in the face, yellow for those who could soon enough be if their wounds were left unchecked, and green for those who were injured, but with ailments so slight there was no rush in getting to them. But in this case, injury so slight could be like, yeah, you fractured your legs in many places, but you ain't gonna die anytime soon, so I'm gonna tend to the other guys.
It's just a scratch.
From there, that which could be done to stabilize their conditions was seen too, and the 10 who had found themselves classified as red victims were away to hospital by 11:17 a.m., which is quite a bit later, but because they're receiving emergency treatment, I imagine, in ambulances, stabilizing them before they can get them to hospital. And of course, while all of that was happening, the firefighters were still hard at it trying to suppress the fire and push their way further into Studio 1, having so far managed to get no further than the ground floor due to the intensity of the flames. They would find no more survivors, however, as it took just too long to reach them, the firefighters having taken until 11:15 to get to the second floor and 11:30 to make it to the third. And while I would hope this was obvious from how I characterized them, but I really want to make sure I'm clear on this matter, the firefighters did everything they could to get to the higher up floors. Oh yeah! I mean, wait, so it took them like 15 minutes to get to another floor? That seems incredibly reasonable, given that the whole place is on fire. The flames were just too damn intense for them to realistically do so, and needlessly adding themselves to the casualty list wouldn't have helped anyone. Yeah, this seems entirely reasonable to me. And if you want more evidence, I don't need more evidence of their bravery. They're incredibly brave. I don't think anyone's doubting that. And it'd be weird if they were like, it's like, why'd you take so long? I don't know, we dilly-dallied, had a cup of tea. It's like, no, they're in a burning inferno. Consider this, when they did reach the second and third floors, the flames had not been extinguished, only lessened. They were in there the moment they were able, and not a second later. As for when it was finally extinguished, that wouldn't be until 3:19 p.m, at which point it had been burning just shy of 5 hours. From there, all efforts were naturally on the retrieval, cataloguing, and identification of the dead, with 2 being found on the ground floor, 11 on the second, and 20 on the third floor. 19 of that final 20 were found on the stairwell, a separate one to the spiral set I mentioned earlier that led right to the roof. In any other fire, this likely would have been more than enough to ensure their survival, especially considering how quickly the fire department got to the scene. But there, in this fire, powered as it was by 40 litres of petrol, they never had a chance. Oh, right, so he poured 20, then there was another 20, I guess, knocking around in that jerry can, which also caught alight. I guess it's a plastic jerry can melted or some such. The initial death toll of 33 would rise soon enough, however, because as I've already said, 3 of the workers who had sprinted through the flames would later succumb to their injuries. This brings the final death toll to 36, just as I said in the introduction. And we can't forget the injured too, as all 33 of them were left with a harrowing range of wounds. Among them, several suffered severe third-degree burns that covered more than half their bodies and required immediate grafting. Third-degree are the worst type of burns, right? Where they get down like, it's not the skin, it's not the little bit below the skin, but it's like to the flesh. This is over half their body. I feel like that is major life in danger territory. Many others face partial limb amputations due to the extent of their injuries, and a number were left with respiratory complications from prolonged smoke inhalation, with some requiring oxygen therapy for weeks. Minor injuries were also widespread. Dozens of people had cuts and lacerations from shattered glass, twisted ankles from stumbling through debris, and fractures from falling while trying to escape. Even the one member of staff who had escaped uninjured had severe psychological trauma. How could he not, as given that 70 people were working there that day, 51% of his colleagues had just been murdered, and a further 47% had been injured? Can we even begin to comprehend the degree of survivor's guilt that comes from an experience like that? I mean, god damn, that's crazy. That is just the vast majority of your colleagues have been affected by this, and you've managed to... Can you imagine if you were just sick that day? You'd be like, oh no, everyone's off work or dead. Crazy. As for the malevolent little parasite who wrought it all upon them, it brings me no end of joy to be able to report that he got royally messed up by the fire he started. I don't want to sound cold, folks, but I'm really not exaggerating when I say that this turn in the story pleases me. The little killed 34 people, and I can't begin to describe to you all the extent to which every cell and fiber of my being is being absolutely burning with rage as I type this out. So yeah, I'm going to gleefully pour all the delicious schadenfreude this twist produces into a glass and down it in one. As for how messed up the consequences of his own actions made him, well, put it this way, 93% of his body was covered in burns, specifically third-degree ones that burn right down to the tissue below the skin, there we go, and cause pain the likes of which can scarcely be appreciated by those who haven't suffered it themselves, not mere first-degree ones that just blister the skin up a bit. So bad was it that his attending physician wrote in his notes that he believed Zako's chance of survival stood at a mere 2.35%. How can you be so specific? Yeah, his chance of survival are 235 out of 1,000. How? 235 out of 10,000. How can you put such a fine point on it? Miraculously, however, Zako overcame the odds. I'm not sure I'd describe that as miraculous, George. I'd go for, unfortunately, Zako overcame the odds. And after a night-long session of surgery, which saw his condition stabilized, I don't know what you're thinking, my friends. It's weird that I didn't begin that sentence with unfortunately, there we go, or an equivalent word to keep reminding you of just how much I despise the very air this cancerous tumor made human breathes, but don't worry, there is a method in my madness. All right, let's see. Which I shall explain simply by saying this. You all don't know how this story ends, but I do. And oh boy, is it a belter of an ending. One that makes me very, very happy that he survived the attack. He's getting executed, isn't he? But we will get to that in good time. For now, let's get back to having a good old hearty chuckle at his self-imposed injuries. Yeah, I think they hang people in Japan. There's like that room, I've seen pictures of it, where it's like they hang people and then there's a room and then there's like a trapdoor on the floor. And they release the trapdoor, and ka-chonk! Which seems like pretty intense. And it seems intense because it is. With his condition stabilized, Zako then found himself with a rather pressing need for a hell of a skin graft. But what would you know it turns out that Japan, like most countries, never quite has enough organs on storage to go round, and through some truly rotten luck, it has to be said, it turns out that at the time, they had enough skin going to sort out all but one person currently awaiting it, and the random lottery system they used to fairly and impartially decide who did and didn't get it just happened to pick out Zako as the one person who was going to have to go without. Do you think that was random, or do you think someone rigged it? The goddess Fortuna truly is an enigmatic lady. As a result of this totally real and in no way made up just make him suffer shortage, Zako had to sit there, enjoying his open wounds while the world's biggest epidermal sheet could be artificially grown from his remaining skin cells. A grand old time he had of it too, getting to enjoy near constant sedation to prevent his body from totally shutting down from shock, which was only interrupted by sporadically being brought back around so that his condition could be assessed, during which time he would cry out in agony and mumble some garbage about how much pain he was in. Yeah, bro needs to be in a medically induced coma. Like, I just like put me out. I'll wake up in 3 months and deal with the consequences then. Thank you. Good night. Basically, for all the Doctor Who fans in the audience, you know that episode? No, never seen. I mean, I watched Doctor Who when I was a kid, but that's about it. You know that episode where Peter Capaldi's Doctor happens upon the hospital full of soon-to-be converted Cybermen who are all just sat there covered head to toe in bandages, unable to say any word but pain over and over again? It was like that, but in real life. Good, isn't it? Couldn't have happened to anyone more deserving. Eventually, however, Zako got his skin graft and all the other things that the wrinkle-brained medical types deemed he needed, and with his condition nicely recovered, or as recovered as it could be given the severity of his injuries anyway, he was discharged from hospital on the 27th of May 2020. Bro, he got discharged from hospital? I hope he got discharged to the police station. And guess how long he got to enjoy his freedom before he was arrested? Surely no time. Surely he's under arrest in the hospital, and they're just waiting for him to be healthy enough to transfer him to prison or jail or wherever they keep people before they decide to put them in that room with the trapdoor. Barely even a single second is the answer to that question, because Giga Chads and Giga Stacies of the Kyoto Prefectural Police, square-jawed and bulging with muscle as they are, were there waiting for him as he signed his discharge papers, cuffs already unlocked, ready to go, with them being slapped around his wrists before the ink had even dried on the paperwork. And with that, we find ourselves at the end of the attacker story, and indeed, the end of the chapter, so now let's move on and have a look at Chapter 2, The Aftermath. For many in the world of animation, both creators and consumers alike, the attack on Kyoto Animation came as a real shock, not only because of the unprecedented barbarism and scale of it all. It reminds me of the Charlie Hebdo attacks. I think that was with guns, right? Was there also a bombing involved with that? I don't quite remember. But where someone had drawn an image of the Prophet Muhammad, and there was a terrorist attack on the Charlie Hebdo officers, and yeah, it's pretty grim stuff, isn't it? The shock came not only because of the unprecedented barbarism and scale, but because the company was, and still is, known as one of the good guys of the industry, with them heavily prioritizing employee welfare through only offering full-time positions, paying wages that a human being can actually live off, as well as some overtime pay on top of it. And that's all in addition to offering very generous holiday allowances by Japanese standards anyway, and an intensive effort to foster up-and-coming talent through in-house training programs. Sounds like a great company to work for. You think, wait, is only full-time a benefit? Because I feel like, what if I just want to work part-time? What if I just like working mornings?
I'm only going to be working here part-time.
In light of those considerations, many were simply dumbstruck, asking themselves, why on God's earth would someone want to attack such a studio? I feel like this guy must be mentally unwell, right? Which is, I mean, I guess not, because otherwise George wouldn't be so insanely harsh on him. And I'm sorry, not insanely harsh on him, as deserved, because if he's not mentally unwell, then obviously he deserves all of this criticism. But if he is genuinely mentally ill, I don't know. It seems like such a bizarre thing to do that I don't know what the motivation is other than mental illness. Memorials were also held across Japan, where the public mourns not only the individuals lost, but also the irreplaceable creative potential that had been extinguished, and naturally Kyoto, as the city of the crime, saw by far and away the greatest concentration of them, with the local outpouring of grief so profound that for weeks following the attack, near continual vigils sprang up near the remains of Studio One, where residents and fans laid flowers, messages, and artwork as tributes. For years, Kyoto Animation had been more than just a business. It was a source of cultural pride and identity for Kyoto. The community's grief was palpable, but so too was its resolve to support the studio in any way possible. As a long-time anime fan myself, that's right, I'm outing myself as a big old weeb, folks. I think you already did at the beginning of the episode, George. I remember the attack happening, and for myself and others similarly invested, it really is one of those where were you on 9/11 moments, with me still able to picture clearly how I was emerging from the Maidan Square subway station in Kiev, Ukraine in the early hours of the morning, having spent a thoroughly enjoyable night on the ale with an old friend who just happened to be on the same flight out as me by pure chance, only to pop my phone open and see the breaking news, and the next thing I knew, I was stuck to a bench, just digging through Twitter to try and get a handle on what the hell was going on, utterly bewildered by the situation. I remember, there's these ones you have, like 9/11, I remember I was in detention. And the teacher opened it up on this big old CRT monitor, oh, you guys should come and have a look at this. Detention voice. Okay.
So, you got detention.
And because I wasn't alone in my sentiments, financial support for Kyoto Animation soon began pouring in from around the world. A GoFundMe campaign launched by Sentai Filmworks, a US-based distributor of anime, for example, raised over $2 million USD, whilst a fund operated by Kyoto Animation, which I remember paying into myself, ended up amassing a little over 3.3 billion yen, or around $30 million US. Kyoto Animation themselves also ended not even drawing a single yen of it for their own rebuilding, and instead transferred the whole lot over to the Kyoto prefectural government, who established a special committee for making sure that the money was spent on the victims and only the victims. Oh my god, good guy Kyoto Animation. You don't even want to use some of that? Like, just a couple of mil to start rebuilding your company? I feel like, yes, of course, give it to the survivors and the people who's died's family, the majority, but you're a good business employing good people. It's okay to use some of it to start up again, I feel. I feel like almost that would bring greater benefit in the long term. Among those left in Kyoto Animation, once they had grieved, thoughts eventually turned to how the hell the company was going to survive when, given that it only had a workforce of 176 prior to the attack, over 20% of its staff had been murdered, and a little under the same percentage, again, had been injured. Okay, so there's a large number of people who were not in this attack. So I assumed that I don't know, because I know nothing about anime. I assume this was like a one office shop sort of situation. But they have a lot more staff, which is good. That's good for their survival. What followed was a lot of rising to the challenge, determination not to let the work of their murdered colleagues be squandered, and desire to not let the bastard win across the board. This saw their next film, Violet Evergarden, Eternity in the Auto Memory Doll, which itself had been finished the day before the attack, and through pure fluke of fate didn't have its digital master copy stored in Studio One, released as planned in September 2019. Bro, if you've worked on a film, like an anime film, which I'm sure is, I don't know, thousands of man hours, tens of thousands of man hours of work, then surely you would have a backup every day off-site, if not more often. The film itself was also made into a memorial for the victims of the attack, with director Haruka Fujita dropping the usual Kyoto Animation standard of needing 1 year's service with the company to be included in the credits, so that his murdered colleagues could have some, quote, proof that they lived. For the productions that were not already finished, however, there was simply no way to avoid delays, with Violet Evergarden, the movie, having its January 2020 release pushed back to September of that same year, and Free the Final Stroke having to be delayed and eventually released as 2 parts to get it out the door in September 2021 and April 2022. Little note from George here. Don't worry, I didn't mistype. Violet Evergarden, Eternity in the Auto Memory Doll, and Violet Evergarden, the movie, are different films. And yes, well, yeah, I assume they're just different films in the same series. And yes, the movies did come out after other movies. Anime names often really don't carry well over to English. Don't worry about it. Not worry about it? Can do, George. Let's move on. As for the site of Studio One, as far as I can tell from news reporting, it appears to be something of limbo at present. The building itself was demolished by April 2020, and not wishing to force their staff to have to return to the scene of such a horrific crime, Kyoto Animation CEO Hideaki Hata instead wished to discontinue the lot's commercial use and see a memorial built on the site. This effort has been resisted by some local residents, however, with the neighborhood association of Moneyama-cho, the area Studio One was in, being publicly vocal about how it didn't wish for a memorial to be built, citing concerns over the footfall it would bring to the quiet residential area. And honestly, fair enough. There was reporting in 2022 that the majority of local residents were now in favor of building a memorial park, however, and that consultancy to see what should be built was actively underway. But as of the time of writing, construction has yet to begin, so who knows? Yeah, I do feel you need to get the permission or at least input from local residents about building something like this, because this seems to be a very big deal, and I think you get a lot of people, fans, tourists, whoever coming to Japan to see this. And if it's in a very residential area or quiet area, then I can understand why local residents would be concerned about that. A memorial has been built elsewhere in Kyoto, however, and designed by Kyoto Animation artists personally. It stands 3 meters tall and is made up of 36 white birds, one for each victim, spiraling toward the sky, and bears the inscription, "Limitless dreams told through animation. In every line drawn, years of cultivated talent and profound sentiment. From here, in Uji, Kyoto, they spread out into the world, taking wing toward our uninterrupted future." That sounds awesome. That sounds like a really nice memorial. I love that idea. And don't worry, I haven't forgotten about the victims. As regular viewers will know, I'm always one to want to shine a spotlight on them and go into details as an absolute priority in my script, and today's no exception. I just think there's a far better place in the script for it than here, and that would be the end, rather than simply cramming them into this otherwise more generally focused chapter, which frankly would make me feel like I was treating them as an afterthought. So with that said, let's put a lid on this chapter and move on to have a look at Chapter 3, The Culprit. I was initially reluctant to include this chapter, as to begin with I wanted to reduce the perpetrator to a little bit of background character in this script, just like I did in my Las Vegas Massacre scripts. And yet here we are, so what happens? I mean, you do need to know something. Like, I do need to know, you want to know motivation, you want to know reason, or if there is no reason, you want to know at least something of why. Well, eager to prevent today's show from drifting into gore porn territory, something that I happen to find absolutely abhorrent, I was eager that we should all come away from today's episode with two things. Firstly, a respectful understanding of the victims and what happened to them, and secondly, some kind of an idea as to why massacres such as this happened in Kyoto at all. And unfortunately, it turns out that the second ambition is kind of difficult if you know nothing about the perpetrators, as they don't exactly just decide to do these things on a whim, do they? This guy does kind of sound like he went there, he sat outside for a few days, he got crazy, and then he went to the petrol station and just decided to burn it down. It does seem almost whim-like. I therefore found myself feeling like I'd arrived at a fork in the road with two places I want to reach, but a path to only one of them. In the end, however, if I looked closely, I believed I could spot a desired path down the middle of that fork, one that would allow me to curve toward wider understanding while still ultimately arriving at the destination of respecting the victims, i.e., in less flowery language, just stripping the perpetrator's biography right down to the bare minimum that you need to understand why he did what he did and not a word more. So that's exactly what I ended up doing. Sounds like a great way to handle it, to be honest, George. With that in mind, I have a quick confession to make. As I might have been telling you a little porky in the last chapter, you see, the perpetrator's name isn't really Zako. That's just a name I came up with so that I didn't have to use his real one, with it translating to pathetic and insignificant creature who isn't to be taken seriously. As names go, it's a good fit. And naturally, no, I won't be telling you his real name, victims first, you know. So, with all of that said, here is Zako's identity-stripped biography for you all. He was born way back in 1978, making him 41 at the time of the attack. As where he was born, I'm just going to say Japan. We don't need to know any more than that. I also can tell you that, to much of my surprise, he was raised in a wholesome and ever-loving nuclear family, one which provided the perfect conditions, both emotionally and materially, for the young Zako to get a head start in life and thrive. No, just joking. Of course he didn't come from such a household. Instead, he came from a terrible one. I mean, I believe it, because we've seen people who turn into absolute pieces of shit because that's just how they were born. Like, they might have been raised in like a super nice family, their parents are like good people, no evidence of anything weird or sketchy in their past, and it's just like, oh, they just like killing. They're just absolutely psychopathic. His parents divorced in 1987 when he was only 9, after which his mother totally vanished from his life for many years. I don't know why she disappeared, as just two explanations are thrown about. The first one states that after enduring horrific abuse from Zako's father, his mother eventually reached a breaking point, made for the hills, and for whatever reason, simply couldn't bring herself to face her children, and the second one posits that she had simply found herself dissatisfied with her lot in life, and so when a new bit of tarty man meat presented itself, she hopped right on top of it and was having such a good time that she just stopped paying heed to her kids. This just seems like wild speculation, but alright. If you were to ask me for gut instinct on what I thought was correct, I'd probably tend towards the second one, as it strikes me as peculiar that she would make no attempt to communicate with her kids for actual years, so maybe she indeed had shacked up with someone and was living her best life. That isn't to say that the abuse explanation doesn't have merit, however, because as we shall soon see, well, let's just say I'd check out. Following the divorce and the beginning of his mother's estrangement, Zako moved into a new flat with his father and his 2 siblings. I didn't find out many details about their new abode, but the ones I did find all spoke the same truth, and that it was a little bit of hovel, small, cramped, and very much dilapidated. Earlier, their material conditions, while modest, hadn't exactly been those of destitution, but as maintaining them had become dependent on both Zako's mother and father bringing something home to chuck in the kitty, poverty absolutely T-boned them at 100 miles per hour. Nonetheless, they preserved, and the bigger of the wolves were kept at the door, or rather they were for a time, because soon enough, Zako's father developed diabetes and found himself unable to work. From there, things got bad, and the family had to get by with what scraps the Japanese welfare state was able to throw their way, and that really was not a lot. Naturally, Zako was attending school through all of that ever-worsening financial hardship, eventually graduating 2 years later than his peers at the age of 20. The delay was caused by the fact that his education had been absolutely devastated by his family's poverty. Twice, his father repeatedly failed to make rent, was subsequently evicted, and had to set up somewhere new, at which point Zako simply waited it out and resat the year when the calendar rolled around. Eager to get his hands on some cash ASAP, Zako took a part-time role at his local prefecture's government document department at the age of 16, and eventually, at the age of 20, despite still being in high school, he even took on a second part-time gig at a petrol station, working behind the till. He may have had other motivations to spend as much time as possible out of the house, however, not that he ever said so outright. Remember when I said the abuse explanation of his mother's departure had some merit to it? Well, yeah, Zako's dad was a bit of a monster, it turns out, although do note that all of my sources say that this started after the divorce, hence why I leaned away from the abuse explanation of why Zako's mother had walked out. As for what Zako suffered, apparently he and indeed his siblings would be used as both verbal and literal punching bags whenever their father happened to find himself irked, be it by something minor like a stubbed toe, or something major like yet another tragic milestone on their unending journey into crushing poverty. My sources disagree over how long this abuse lasted, with some saying it eventually subsided a year or two after the divorce, and others saying it persisted until he eventually left the family home. It's safe to say Zako's early life was pretty and to deal with it all, he naturally had an outlet for venting steam. In this case, it would be otakuing. And George has a little note here. For those of you not in the know, and I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that Simon is counted among those, yes! Otaku is a Japanese term that refers to someone who has nerdy interests, think specifically anime, manga, video games and the like, and takes it really, really to unhealthy extremes, the point of becoming incredibly socially withdrawn so that they can better indulge their hobby. In the most extreme cases, an otaku might become a NEET, so that they can indulge in their hobbies full-time, NEET meaning not in education, employment, or training, i.e. a person that's fully withdrawn from society and depends upon social welfare or handouts from their family, and sometimes even both in order to survive. That's like isn't that quite a sad existence? Where it's like, you just sit at home and you don't have a job, and you just live off welfare while reading anime. That sounds super depressing. Guess how much it's like, how much. But even if I was just staying at home watching let's say I had an infinite number of episodes of my favorite show, I think after about a day of that, I'd be like, I need to do something productive or I'm going to go mad. Still maintaining some desire for dignity in his life, however, and having wanted to avoid descending into becoming a full-on NEET, Zako decided to pursue his dreams, enrolling at a local vocational music school so that he could, and I'm quoting here, become a person who makes music for video games. My how do you say the person who's your cousin, but only because someone in your family remarried? Second cousin? Cousin once removed? Step cousin? I don't know. He does. He's a composer for music for video games. He kept on working to pay for it too, swapping in all of his other gigs for a job delivering newspapers, which was nice and flexible around his studies. Now, perhaps some of you attempted to take pity on Zako at this point, as he had quite a bad time of it in his early years. To those of you being so inclined, however, I have but one thing to say: hold your horses and strap in tight, because we're about to see a hell of a spiral. It all began when he completed 6 months of his music course, dropping out not because of financial hardship or any other tragic and understandable circumstance, but due to the fact that unbeknown to his family, his friends, his lecturers, or anyone besides himself, in fact, the sun had started to royally shine out of his arse. And as a result, he'd come to realize that actually he was simply better than everyone else around him, dropping out of school because, and this is an exact quote, "they have nothing to teach me." Holy the arrogance, dude. Following that, when dozens of job applications, the video games industry overall, promptly found their way to receiving the office's paper shredder, Zako decided that the age of NEET had finally dawned, with him quitting his newspaper delivery job and taking up residence in a tiny little cupboard flat where, thanks to the unending generosity of the Japanese taxpayer, he was able to be alone with his ever-growing piles of manga, anime tapes, video games, and of course his own sense of self-superiority. Yes, you sound so superior in a little cupboard, don't you? Personally, I like to think that the choice of a cupboard flat was not due to poverty, but rather because a smaller, less ventilated abode allowed him to huff his own farts in greater concentration, but I digress. Cupboard flat sounds grim. Especially, like, Japan is going to be really small, right? Japan's densely populated. At least in the... It is, right? Yeah, Japan's small, there's a massive population. And they got mountains as well, which pushes all the people onto the coasts, right? Never been to Japan, I'd love to go. A friend of mine moved to Japan. He now lives in Japan. He's been there like a year and a half.
Same, but different.
From there, Zako simply wallowed in his own existence. He'd wake up, play his video games, read his manga, and watch his anime all day every day, with his non-stop hedonistic indulging being only interrupted by the occasional trip to a bank to cash his government-issued NEET bucks, and the odd trip to a convenience store to use as little money as possible to acquire as many calories as possible, leaving all the more money for his hobbies. Bro's gonna be eating a lot of rice. What is the cheapest calorie? It's gotta be just oil or something, right? It's just eating oil. This, would you believe it, wasn't exactly great for Zako's psyche, and he started to find it ever harder to relate to those around him. Bro, because you live in a cupboard and you don't interact with anyone, which caused the abject collapse of his social skills and the distance he had to climb to emerge from the pit to put himself into seemingly growing ever taller by the day. His elder sibling attempted to intervene for a time and made regular appearances at his cupboard flat accordingly, but would you believe it? There are only so many times that a well-wisher can be told to go suck on a fat one until they just give up and leave you to wallow in your own filth. Yup. But no descent is entirely smooth, as invariably, their specific trajectory rises and dips with each passing day, while maintaining their overall downward course over a longer period of time, and sure enough, Zako's was no different, as from time to time, when he happened to find himself on an upper of a day, an attempt would be made to grab the edge of the proverbial pit it hurled himself into with a view of pulling himself out. So he doesn't want to be in this situation, but he's fully put himself in this situation, which is strange. The issue was that such moments of enthusiasm were fleeting, and when, say, he managed to land himself in some part-time work at a convenience store, a job which he reportedly only got out of pity from the manager, who had long since figured out the specifics of his tragic lifestyle thanks to his sporadic visits to stock up on neat slop, a day later, he would wake up bright and early, ready to carpe diem and all that, only to soon enough realize he'd rather sit on his futon and bash out another Bishojo game. Bishojo game is a male-orientated dating sim, one in which your relatable everyman protagonist encounters a horde of ladies who are desperate to give them their daily dose of vitamin D and start a totally realistic, healthy, and not incel-coded relationship with you, on which they dote on you and remind you every 5 minutes of how great you are. And while such games aren't my cup of tea personally, for you, George, this is what I do all day. At least in their standard form, there does exist a subgenre of Bishojo games that royally take the piss out of their internet absurdity and end up being very, very funny. As an example, consider Paka Plus, where you play as Kazuma Seiki, an average student who finds himself torn from choosing a harem of anthropomorphic alpacas and panzer models, which is exactly the same, but with the harem being made up of anthropomorphized World War II tanks. What the f*** is going on, Japan? I chose Type 3. Chinu, if you're interested. I wasn't, George. What's going on? Japan is so strange sometimes. Why is he having to choose a harem of World War II tanks? A harem of anthropomorphic World War II tanks is a sentence I never thought I would say. Eventually, Zako reached new depths of depravity and began venting his frustrations through criminal acts, and sadly, as you no doubt have guessed from my characterization of him, they were, of course, sexual ones, partly anyway. Wow, that's not what I expected. I kind of just thought he was like a weirdo incel. I didn't expect him to be like doing some sexual crimes. I have no idea how many he committed, as the details are only available for incidents that he was apprehended for, which was in September of 2006, and ended up landing him with a sexual assault and theft charge. But given that the whole incident was a tad extreme, I personally don't believe it was his only sexual crime at this point in the story. There has to have been some sort of escalation. As for the specifics, Zako climbed up onto a balcony to steal a pair of women's underwear that had been left hanging out to dry, having been washed. Yeah, that sounds like Zako, doesn't it? But that, of course, only covers the theft charge, with the one for sexual assault coming as a result of what he did next, as he then proceeded to enter the home whose balcony stood atop and attempted to, R-word for YouTube, the woman inside. The key word here is attempt, however, as thankfully said woman was able to fight him off and royally beat the shit out of him before calling the police. King legend. You're such a little bitch. You like try to do like horrible crimes and your victim beats the shit out of you. Yes! Given the severity of the charges he faced, Zako was held on remand until the day of his trial, which was in March 2007. And I have to say, too, that, frankly, his sentence rather pisses me off somehow after pleading guilty and citing sexual frustration and being frustrated due to a lack of money as his motivations. Bruh. Can you imagine how many young men would be like, oh yeah, no, sexual frustration and a lack of money? Oh, come on now. He got an absolute slap on the wrist. 2 years in prison, suspended for 4 years. I.e., be a good boy for 4 years, and we'll forget the whole home invasion and attempted malarkey, as if it never happened. Wait, so he didn't go to prison? He just got 4 years suspended. So they're just like, go home and be good. He attempted to someone. Oh god, I said the word. I guess we can duck it out in editing. Now, folks, I type before you as but a man who has had the cuddly and fluffy liberal he used to be on matters of law and order stamped out by 3 years of being a professional true crime writer, but in my own personal dictatorial utopia, where I was free to act as the ultimate arbiter of all matters, Zako, given the fact that irrefutable evidence existed that he, attempted to someone, would be getting physically castrated at the bare minimum. If I was in a utopia, I'd be like, 5 years prison. I'll be like, off you go to prison for 5 years. We'll see if it reforms you, and we'll keep you on a watch list for the next decade. Not meaning, there's going to be any terrible consequences. You're not on parole or whatever. It's just we're going to keep an eye on you. And if you do it again, we'll put you away for double as long. Or just straight up fed feet first through a wood chipper if I was in a bad mood. Look, I have no comment there. Actually, I don't want to say anything like that. I don't think he should be put in a wood chipper. He killed 30-something people, but feels like a lot. I appreciate my position is an extreme one, but come on, Japan, a suspended sentence? Really? Yeah, I agree. This is extremely light. Having gotten off scot-free, Zako emerged from the court expecting to find what little life he had in tatters, as after all, who had been paying his rent and who had been collecting his neat bucks from the Japanese taxpayers. Well, actually, it was his mum, it turns out, the same one that disappeared, 19 years prior, without leaving so much as a trace of where she went. The police had tracked her down following Zako's arrest and feeling rather guilty over the absolute state of a man that her now 28-year-old son had become, she decided to finally step up and do some parenting, having paid Zako's rent while he was detained and giving him an offer to move in with her and her new husband. Wow, yeah, but also, you are part of what he became. Don't abandon your kids. He took her up on the offer and just about managed to hold down part-time work until December 2008, at which point he received the golden ticket of any aspiring NEET social housing. This allowed him to cut his expenses to the point where he didn't even have to bother with sporadic work to keep a roof over his head, with his basically free flat and minimal monthly stipends being more than enough to cover his expenses. And so he dropped out of the workforce altogether and retreated to his latest goon cave permanently. I recently learned about the word goon. That's what he'll be doing there. He's gooning in there, isn't he? It means masturbation. People who are my age. So this doesn't seem right. You should be getting social housing if you're looking for a job, or they should put you in a job. You shouldn't be just getting it for free so you can live off the state. This just doesn't seem right. I don't like the idea that my taxpayer money goes towards that. Not in this case, because it's in Japan, but you know what I mean. This naturally didn't exactly do wonders for his connection to reality, something that, thanks to recent history, we can all relate to. Remember how we all went a touch peculiar during lockdown after spending months on end getting basically no social contact or sunlight? What a glorious time. Yes, that was what happened to Zako, but he had it to an even greater extent, thanks to his isolation being way longer lived. How do you get to keep your house if you're not going and looking for work? Why do you get to be in social housing without even making an effort? We shouldn't be paying people just to sit at home and read comics. That's insane. And I'm saying we because I absolutely know it's not just Japan doing this. I live in Europe. We're quite famous for this, aren't we? I'm sounding very conservative right now. I just like people to make an effort. Sounds even more conservative. I'm getting old, guys. I'm really getting old. You get old and you're like, fine, I see young people doing nothing. Spending my money. And just like we all did in lockdown, Zako eventually found himself bored of his isolation, and he turned to a new hobby, which for him was writing. I can certainly relate to that, let me tell you folks. But whereas my own isolated dabbling with pen got a bit out of hand and led me to accidentally landing my dream career, you're fucking welcome, George. I have no idea if he's talking about actually writing these, but I'm going to take it like he is and enjoy that. Zako's good, it was less successful. His efforts began in 2009 when he began writing novels inspired by the works of Kyoto Animation, with particular points of inspiration being things like Clannad and K-On!, both series which were based off other works, a visual novel and a manga respectively, and whose on-screen success had led to their writers making lots and lots of money as a result. Certain that fame and fortune awaited him once he had pumped out a few novels, Zako set to work, yes, becoming a novelist, the guaranteed way to riches. I was originally going to include some extracts from his novels at this point so that we could all have a good old point and laugh at them. I'm all about belittling and ridiculing the wicked, as long-term fans will be able to vouch for. But what with the whole minimum information thing that I'm going for in this chapter, let's just not shine any spotlight on him at all. That's not to say I didn't find them, however, as with small extracts of them being tucked away in corners of long since forgotten anime forums, they are absolutely out there. And trust me, they are horrific. And that is coming from a fellow with crippling imposter syndrome who pulls his hair out stressing over the quality of every piece he submits. So you know that Zako's work really is for me to be saying that. George, you give yourself too hard of a time, mate. These are maybe it's because you give yourself too hard of a time that these are really quite something. But I don't know, George. It's very good stuff. You're definitely not an imposter, that's for damn sure. And speaking of anime forums, that nicely segues us to our spawn. No, it doesn't. It segues us to the next development in Zako's story, because while he was attempting to drum up hype and support for his ascension into literary divinity, something that the other forum users made rather apparent might not be the most realistic aspiration, he also found himself utterly convinced that he had found the anonymous burner account of one of Kyoto Animation's female directors, and of course, because Zako was nothing if not predictable, he was utterly convinced that he entered a romantic relationship with her not long after, eventually believing that the line, "Why don't you show your face?" from Kyoto Animation's 2012 show Love, Chunibyo, and Other Delusions was aimed at him. What? A tacit message from his supposed lover that she wanted him to reveal his face to her and take their relationship to the next level. George says it's cracker show, by the way. If, like me, you were utterly cringe-inducing as a child, you'll find this very relatable. Everyone's cringe-inducing as a child. This doesn't seem like he's mentally well. There was that story in the paper the other day, that French woman who thought she was in a relationship with Brad Pitt for like a year and a half, when it was just like an AI voice of Brad Pitt. I don't want to laugh, it's horrible. And she was scammed out of loads of money. 2012, incidentally, was also the year that Zako, after a constant barrage of criticism from his anime forum, finally had to contend with the fact that actually he was an atrocious writer and his dream was not happening. Naturally, he handled this revelation with all the grace and restraint that you'd expect, and so on the 19th of June, he found himself in a convenience store, knife in hand, holy demanding that the cashier get that till open and hand the Hideo Noguchi's over. I guess that's like Japan's Benjamin Franklin's. He made off with 21,000 yen, about $140. Bro, you're committing way too serious a crime for $140, and handed himself into the police on the same day. A lackluster robbery to be sure by the show standards, but hey, at least his armed robbing was more successful than his writing. Yeah, but he handed himself into the police. He's not going to keep that $140. And boy, did he say some stuff in his interview. For example, he spoke very highly of the perpetrator of the 2008 Akihabara massacre, who killed 7 and injured 11 by way of the truck and knife. And further to that, he said the following when his family came up, quote, "When I lost my job, I wanted to set them on fire, including my mother and brother. Get him on a list. Get him on the watch list." Such rantings did little to endear the judiciary to Zako when his time in court came, and as a result, they handed him a custodial sentence of 3 years and 6 months for violation of the Firearms and Swords Control Law. Okay, wait, he got no time in prison for the attempted R-word of a woman. And now he's getting 3 years and 6 months for robbery? Oh, I suppose it's armed robbery. I mean, look, I'm just happy to have him in prison, to be honest. In prison, he really didn't do well, which is really weird given the scant difference between prison life and the conditions he was willing to impose upon himself on the outside, but I digress. So bad did things get, in fact, that come July 2013, he was on suicide watch, but with it being noted that he was suffering from both auditory and visual hallucinations. I think he's going down a path of mental illness. Like, the delusions of the relationship to the it's what it's called. It's not a delusion. It's oh god, why can't I remember that word? Like a vision, not a vision. It's a really obvious word. God damn it. Hallucination, it was right there. He's gone from delusions to hallucinations. Things only got worse from there too, with him being placed in solitary confinement in November 2014. That's going to do wonders for his mental health, after he had tried to lay out a prison guard who had reprimanded him for tampering with an exterior window. He was eventually released in January 2016, and with the consequences of his own actions having left him in quite the sorry state, he was immediately admitted to a rehabilitation facility before he was eventually moved into supervised accommodation by July of the same year. Honestly, Japan, that sounds like a good way to handle people who've been in prison. To some sort of, I assume, rehabilitation, not for drugs, but back into society, and then into a supervised accommodation. I think that sounds like a very, very sensible way of getting people back into society. But there, he immediately fell straight back into his old habits, living off social welfare, writing terrible novels, and being thoroughly convinced that he was sat atop the cusp of greatness. And the criticism that had caused his last spiral, well, that was now but a long-forgotten memory. I'm not exaggerating either when I allude to his being rather deluded, as he said the following about his ambitions for the future, quote, "I will debut as a writer in 1 year, buy a house in 5 years, and become a big name in 10 years. I mean, at least he's, laying out a I know it sounds insane, but I don't know, 10 years ago I had nothing. And now I'm like, I don't know, doing my YouTube thing. It's going all right. I think If I said I'll debut as a YouTuber in a year, I did it a bit quicker than that because he just published, straight away. Buy a house in 5 years, yes. And became a big name in 10? I mean, in my little corner of the internet, I suppose so. I think so. But God, as they say, loves a trier. And so Zako completed and submitted 2 novels for Kyoto Animation Award, an annual competition by the titular company that finds and publishes promising new writers, and even teases the possibility of the winners being turned into an anime if they really crush it following their print publication. All right, mate. Well, you've got to, 1, get accepted into the competition, 2, win the competition, and then your book has to sell enough copies for them to it's not happening, mate. It's just not happening. Zako's 2 submissions didn't even make it past the first round because they were Still undeterred, somehow he then edited and self-published the novels online, but gave it up as a bad job when they attracted minimal attraction. Again, because they were bad. With things not going swimmingly for him, Zako also started getting more and more violent during this time. For example, in May 2018, he grabbed a nurse by the collar, raised a knife to his throat, and screamed, quote, "I'm so sexist." I'm like, raise a knife to his throat? A male nurse. Oh, what's wrong with me? You're being too persistent. Stop bothering me or I'll kill you. But tragically, persistency was the one thing that was really needed at this point, as in the coming year, he would begin descending down his greatest spiral yet, one that would culminate with his attack on Kyoto Animation. By February 2019, he had flatly stopped attending his mental health checkups. By March, with the doctors being very eager to find him and get their hands on him, he started going to extreme lengths to avoid them, doing things like destroying his phone and discarding it, completely abandoning his flat on days when a checkup was scheduled, and barricading his door and leaping from the window if the doctors tried to spring an unannounced visit on him. I don't know what the Japanese equivalent of a parole officer is, but it sounds like this dude needs to go back to prison because he's not meeting the conditions of his release. I'm assuming these would be conditions of his release, otherwise I'd just say no. By June, he'd completely snapped and was proactively planning a massacre. He began by acquiring his weapons, a set of 6 20-centimeter kitchen knives that he purchased from a department store, the same ones that he would take to Kyoto Animation, incidentally, and then set about picking his target. At this point, however, he did not have his sights set on Kyoto Animation, and instead he picked Omiya Station as his target, as the long and open approach up to the station front would be perfect for his Akihabara Massacre-inspired plan, which involved him plowing a car into a crowd and then stabbing said crowd until the police shot him dead. I don't understand these people. This is just madness. Mercifully, he chickened out of that scheme like a coward bitch. But the wish to commit a massacre remained in his mind, growing ever stronger and more firmly planted now that he no longer cared for that niggly little voice of doubt that made him cool off his attack at Omiya. Obviously, it was something related to Kyoto Animation that had made him cross the Rubicon. But what? In a word, plagiarism. More specifically, plagiarism that Zako had completely fabricated in his own mind to make Kyoto Animation the scapegoat for his own failures. After all, he was the greatest writer that the world had ever seen, wasn't he? So it made no sense at all that Kyoto Animation just rejected his scripts for being terrible. No. They must have been stealing his ideas for their own profit. It was the only explanation that made any sense. At least he chose to believe it was. People, it's really remarkable what the human brain can do to protect its own ego and other things. Like, we can make up all sorts of stories, and if you told them to someone else, they'd be like, what the f*** are you talking about? That's absolutely crazy. And you'd be like, I guess, in my own mind, that's why I protected my ego. I can't think of a specific example, but I feel like we've seen this several times in Casual Criminalist. I'm trying to think of an example from myself, but I don't think I'm that delusional, or at least, maybe not delusional, just like, I'm just a logic machine. But there's plenty of examples from people who've been featured on this podcast or YouTube channel, depending on how you're consuming this content. And leave a review, why not? Get some gamer subs, gamersubs.gg/TCC. Yes. Plugs out of the way, let's move on. He found evidence for this too, folks. You see, after stringent obsessing, he discovered a brief scene in episode 5 of Tsurune, a Kyoto Animation show that had dropped the previous year, in which the characters bought cheap meat, and right there, in one of Zako's stories, was a scene in which his characters also bought cheap meat. Coincidence? Zako certainly didn't think so. Bruh, it's a coincidence, my dude. And also, you don't think that these companies have, there's a word for this, where you keep things separate so they can't accuse you of stealing ideas. Whereas, like, you run a competition and people send in ideas, it's like they're not read by the writers. Because otherwise, if there's something similar does happen, they'll be accused of stealing this idea, and that could be problematic. Whereas if you just say, our writing department never looks at them, then that's, that's it. So no, they didn't steal your idea, you douchebag. He found other evidence too. Specifically a scene in 2018's Free Dive to the Future, in which a banner reading Swimming Club advances to regional tournament can be seen blowing among other banners. To Zako's mind, this was a one-to-one rip-off of a scene in one of his novels where the banners were described flying in the background, not with the same text, mind you, not even the same context, just a scene that also had banners in the black backgrounds. This is insane. These are just generic things. You can't possibly think that they're your unique ideas. He also had a third and final piece of evidence from the show K-On! I'll spare you the specifics of what he believed was copied, as it's the same kind of thing as the other two. It's total twaddle. But I will tell you one thing about K-On! That makes Zako's accusations of plagiarism even more absurd. And that's being that it's such an old show. Now, I'm 29 years old. George isn't. I wish I was. First watched it in high school, with its two series, dropping in 2009 and 2010, and its capping movie being released in 2011. And Zako started writing the novels he submitted to Kyoto Animation in 2016 at the earliest. Dude, so you ripped them off, you scumbag! But tragically, such realities mattered naught to Zako at this point, and so the scene was set for the horror we had to hear about in our first chapter. And I don't know about you, but after all of that, I'm quite ready to start hearing about some justice. So let's move on and look at Chapter 4. The Trial. Get him in that room with the trapdoor. Get him in the room with the trapdoor! Zako's first pre-trial arrangement session. Arrangement? Not sure. Was held on the 8th of May, 2023. It's so recent. I kind of like 2023 last year. I'm still stuck in 2024. It's 2025. At the Kyoto District Court, this bit wasn't anything too exciting in fairness, with the whole pre-trial arrangement thing, at least as I understand it, basically just a meeting where they sketch out what resources will be... so it is just an arrangement. Will be needed for the trial's execution and iron out some preliminary details before beginning proper. But nonetheless, some interesting details did come up, chief among which was the fact that several of the names of Zako's victims were to remain confidential throughout proceedings. I mean, I think that's a victim's right. If you're a victim of something and you don't want to be named at trial and appear, it's entirely up to you. Or at least it should be. I think you should have your privacy respected like that. As for why, well, that's interesting. That'd be because keeping victims confidential in murder cases, and in all fairness, all types of cases, is very rare in Japan. Okay, that is with one huge and glowing exception anyway, and that would be for sexual crimes. In such cases, victims are guaranteed confidentiality should they wish for it, as a matter of course. A move intended to help give victims the confidence to come forward and report their experiences free from worry over reprisal or social stigma, or as the Japanese Criminal Procedure Code itself puts it, the victim's honor or social peace. I don't know how it works in other countries. I think in the UK, if someone's on trial, we know who they are. And it's like you can see them in the paper, they go up to the court and all of that stuff. Here, where I live in Czech, unless someone's guilty, they're always just referred to as Mr. R or Mr. S. And whenever you see photos of them in the papers or on the news, their faces are always blurred. So you don't know who they are until they've been proven guilty. Which I kind of like. I think that's a good system. Although it's pretty sloppy and I figure that people could probably work it out. But the media is not allowed to say, which I think keeps most people in the dark. Which is, I think that's good. Because unless someone's guilty, then they shouldn't face the court of public opinion as well. I know it's not that simple, but I quite like that. But not every victim of the Kyoto Animation attack would be kept confidential. Do note, with the decision being placed entirely at the behest of the victim, had they survived the attack, or their next of kin, had they not. This led to censoring of 19 of the 36 deceased, all of the 33 had been injured, and the one individual who had made it out of Studio One unscathed. And if you're wondering how they were referred to once censored, the court, I assume they'd just be like Mr. A, Mr. B, etc. The court established 3 appendices of victims, with Appendix 1, 2, and 3 as they were titled, cataloguing anonymous deceased, injured, and uninjured victims, respectively. From there, each victim was assigned a number within those appendices, 1 through 19 for Appendix 1, 1 to 34 for Appendix 2, and just 1 for Appendix 3. In terms of the court's vernacular, this would lead to, say, an anonymous deceased victim being referred to as quite literally Appendix 1, number 6. I mean, that's fine. That's what they've requested. And I don't think it's disrespectful. I think it's respectful. This was a bit wooden, sure, but it certainly did the job of protecting the victim's anonymity without turning the court proceedings into a convoluted mess. So it's a smart solution as far as I'm concerned. I don't understand what's wrong with Mrs. R or like Mr. P. Or like if it's If the name's taken, then Mr. P1. And if you're wondering why I mentioned this at all, and didn't just craft my script in a way that smoothly circumvented the legalese word salad, that would be because, firstly, I will be directly referencing specific victims later in the chapter, and also because should my script spark your curiosity and send you off down your own rabbit hole of research, you will quickly encounter these terms. I didn't want you to find yourself scratching your head at a miss for what they mean. And with the pre-trial arrangement session bashed out, next came the selection process for the judge that would preside over the trial proper. Now, we're not going to worry too much about the actual process by which they were chosen, as that is way, way below the abstraction layer for our purposes today, but I will share this little fact nugget from within it with all of you. In Japan, the more horrific, complicated, and high-profile a case, the more judges the court will summon for consideration out of an understandable want to make sure that they get the right person for the job, and for the Kyoto Animation arson attack, 500 were summoned for consideration. My source for this is an article on a very proper and official-looking Japanese legal site, which claimed that it was the second highest amount ever summoned in Japan's history, with the highest amount being for the 2017 Kansai cyanide serial murder case, for which 920 were summoned. Wow. I personally doubt this claim, as Japan has quite a lot of really extreme crimes, which you'll be learning about in my coming scripts, but either way, the key point of this paragraph remains the same, that being that summoning 500 judges is a huge amount, and it proves just how seriously the judiciary were taking this case. As for which of those 500 ended up receiving the honours, that would be a fellow by the name of Judge Kisuke Masuda. If you search for him in English, you get nothing, and I literally mean nothing. A million copy and paste articles talking about the verdict he rendered at the end of the trial, and a single photograph of him that you're almost certainly not going to see on screen right now because it's on Getty Images. It costs £375 to license. Yep. That. You just have to imagine what he looks like. In my mind, I'm imagining a Japanese man wearing those, the traditional wigs that, a British judge would wear, which I don't imagine they wear in Japan. But maybe. If you search for him in Japanese, however, you are able to get a measure of him as an incredibly competent, but otherwise quite typical criminal judge. Plenty of murder cases to his name, and a few academic articles discussing a range of thrilling topics such as Japan's steadily increasing bail approval rate and the finer points of historic tax fraud cases. So, all in all, like I say, competent and normal as far as judges come. With all that said, the trial finally began on September the 5th, 2023. And annoyingly, whereas I normally like to refer to original court documents for this section of a script, I simply was not able to get access to them this time. I even popped down to the court in person. In Japan? Are you in Japan, George? I thought you lived in Hong Kong. We're always talking about Hong Kong. Did George go to Japan? To have an ask about getting my hands on a copy, just to be told very politely in fairness that it wasn't possible. But don't worry, I was in town anyway to visit a theme park that had a life-size copy of my favourite anime mecha, Evangelion Unit 1, if you're interested. I wasn't, but thanks. As well as the Kyoto Railway Museum. So the trip wasn't a wasted one. I've also stuck a picture of said trip in the index for your entertainment, and the editor should be pulling it up now. Look how happy I am. I had a grand old time. You do look like you're having a great time there, George. Why is that statue, though? Fortunately, however, while said trip might not have got me any transcripts, when I got back home, I put my mind to figuring out what sources I could collect from the comfort of my office chair, and I discovered that even had the courts put a transcript together for me, it would have been moot anyway, as Kyoto Shimbun, a local Kyoto newspaper, had a reporter in the courtroom throughout it all, and so diligent was said reporter and their colleagues that the paper ended up essentially producing a publicly accessible court transcript anyway. Legends, publishing hundreds of thousands of words on the matter. That'll certainly do for us today, I think. Okay. They began naturally by reading out the charges being levied against Zako, which specifically were 36 counts of murder and 1 violation of the firearms and swords control law for the knives that he had brought along with him. I like that they called knives swords. And while we already know what he did very well, thus making going over the specifics of those charges a tad redundant in some ways, I'd like to give you a slightly lengthy excerpt from what was said nonetheless, as the tone used is really interesting. We'll quote here. Quite a long quote, settle in. The victims were engulfed in flames, black smoke, and intense heat immediately after the defendant spread gasoline and ignited it. These individuals perished under horrifying circumstances. Some had no time to escape from the first floor, while others succumbed to burns as they tried to flee to the second floor balcony or the rooftop. Others suffocated due to being trapped beneath others near the second floor balcony or rooftop staircase, or as a result of inhaling smoke and high heat near the rooftop. Additional victims died from carbon monoxide poisoning. 3 victims who managed to escape despite being directly doused with gasoline and set alight succumbed to their injuries shortly after. One died the next day from severe burns, another passed away about a week later due to sepsis caused by their injuries, and a third endured more than 2 months of suffering, undergoing multiple surgeries, regaining consciousness but unable to move freely, before dying from septic shock caused by extensive burns. These victims, engaged in their usual work, producing animations, were suddenly and without warning thrust into a living hell. They suffered unimaginable fear and pain, ultimately meeting untimely deaths. The scale of the terror, suffering, and the cruelty inflicted upon these victims is indescribable. The 36 deceased employees represented a wide range of dedicated individuals, veteran staff who had worked at Kyoto Animation since its inception, striving to improve the harsh working conditions of the animation industry and mentoring their juniors, mid-career employers who joined Kyoto Animation with great admiration for the studio, excelling in their roles and passing down their skills to the next generation, and young staff who had only recently overcome significant challenges to join the studio, eagerly pursuing their dreams in animation. These individuals had come from all over Japan to work as a unified team, pouring their love and care into every creation. Despite leading peaceful lives with their families, they were suddenly and unjustly robbed of their futures by this crime. The grief and frustration over such an irreparable loss are beyond comprehension. And the long quote ends. And rather well put, isn't it? See what I mean about the tone? Although worded rather professionally, of course, it's also highly emotive. Yeah, you kind of forget that it's a court document there, don't you? It's also the kind of language that only comes out when the prosecutor knows he's sat before an absolute demon of a man and that he is banged to rights with absolute irrefutable evidence. Next came the testimonials, both from the bereaved and from the survivors, and I'm going to give you a few choice examples as quotes, as there is simply no way I could regurgitate them to you secondhand that would convey even a fraction of the emotion of the original. Starting with the testimony of a bereaved victim, quote, "I'm the father of 132. My son was second of my children. I was running a market shop, and life was busy, so I couldn't spend much time with him. I remember coming home when he was in elementary school and seeing him watching anime in the kotatsu. The kotatsu, if you're wondering, is a type of low table they use in Japan that comes with a built-in heater and thick blankets dangling off the side to keep you warm in winter. Cool." Back to the quote. "He loved Space Battleship, Yamato, and Galaxy Express 999. He attended local schools through high school, never going through a rebellious phase. He was kind, always observing others and acting thoughtfully. During the Great Hanshin earthquake, I called him, and he immediately came to help. He always decided his own future and made his own plans. He studied animation at Yoyogi Animation Academy in Osaka, and we always supported his decisions. After graduating, he joined Kyoto Animation. I never saw his drawings and didn't know he was talented. I'd initially recommended other jobs, as I'd heard animators worked under very poor conditions. He only came home 2 to 3 times a year, but after marrying, he visited about once a month. The last time I saw him was June 23rd, 2019. As he left, he high-fived his child. I said, 'Take care,' and he replied, 'You too.'" Appendix 1. Number 32's wife also offered testimony to the court. Quote, "My husband worked at Kyoto Animation, where we met and started dating. He handled video and key animation, often acting as a team leader. He taught younger staff the basics of animation and how to create motion. We got married 10 years ago and had 2 children, aged 7 and 3. We were living a happy life together." At this point, photos were then shown to the court. One of 132 with his family on holiday, another of him at home, smiling as he played with his daughter, and a third one which was taken at his parents' house on New Year's Day 2018. Continuing the quote, "These are just snapshots of our everyday life. He attended animation school. Before joining Kyoto Animation, he worked on props and instrument designs, adjusting the accessories and instruments characters used. He contributed as an animation director at the Melancholy of Harushi Suzumiya and Clan. At work, he was dedicated to mentoring younger staff. If they struggled to understand his explanations, he'd leave notes on their desks the next morning or patiently guide them until they understood. On the morning of the attack, it was just like any other day. My son went to school and my husband left for work. We said, 'Have a good day,' as usual. I dropped our daughter off at daycare and headed to work myself. While I was at the second studio, I heard there was a fire at the first studio. I didn't know the extent of the fire and felt uneasy. My husband would always contact me in emergency, so I waited anxiously. Watching the news and seeing the building engulfed in flames, my worry grew, but there was nothing I could do but wait. We gathered at the 5th studio, where we were told my husband wasn't among those transported to hospitals and that unidentified or lightly injured individuals were receiving treatment. That evening, I went home. My husband and I shared locations via GPS, and I saw that he was still near the studio. I thought he must have been receiving medical care and couldn't contact me yet. The next day, my in-laws came, and we submitted DNA samples to the police academy. On the 24th of July, we were notified. that he had passed away. Now, normally I chop up and condense the longer quotes, folks, but I've only done the most gentle condensing here, and even that was only in order to make the quotes match up with the grammar and structure of the rest of the script. The raw outpouring of grief in these testimonies is something that, in my opinion, would be an affront to overly streamline. These are statements whose authors spent weeks, if not months, poring over them, knowing full well that when they were spoken, it would be during their one and only time to ever communicate directly to their loved one's killer, and as such, they represent a vital part of their grieving process, with every word and cadence being chosen very specifically to perfectly communicate their emotions as they were at the time. That, in my opinion, means that we owe it to them to listen to their words as they intended them to be heard, well, barring their being translated anyway. But there isn't exactly much we can do about that. With that in mind, let us now move on to the type of testimony which is arguably even more important than that of the bereaved, which would be that of the survivors, starting with Appendix 2, number 29. Quote, I participated in the meeting where we decided the scenario for Tsusrune, but which you claim was plagiarized. Your name was never mentioned. No one read your novel. I didn't read it either. The same applies to other works. We never referenced your work during production. Your plagiarism claim is entirely delusional. I can firmly say this is not the kind of company that will commit such acts. Also, your work sucked. I know I want to plagiarize it anyway, you douche. That's not a quote from her. Sorry, this is I'll carry on. Those who were in Studio One had absolutely no connection to you. None of them read your novel. You killed 36 people over a baseless assumption. Please engrave this truth in your heart. Every day, the faces of the deceased appear in my mind. Time has stopped in 2019 for those friends we lost, for those who still suffer, and for their families. I find myself wondering whether it's okay for me to enjoy life or be happy. Then there's the statements of Appendix 2, number 30, quote, I joined the company in 2018 and 2019 was the first year I had junior staff under my guidance. In my first year, I was doing my best to keep up and thinking about what I could do as a manager. I could only manage because I had my seniors. My juniors were absorbing knowledge and trying to create works. The lively and dramatic environment filled with passionate clashes over our projects was something I truly loved. On the day of the restroom, I fled to the restroom. Why? Everyone's okay, right? Everyone's here. They have to be. I kept telling myself this. Alongside two others who took refuge, I repeated, we'll make it out alive. We'll get out of here. Everything's going to be okay. I kept saying these words. After being rescued, I searched for everyone in the manager's room, but all I found were bloody footprints. People covered in blood. People burned so badly they couldn't speak. I didn't know what to do. I reminded myself that I was a manager. I told myself I should know my team and act. I asked them, where does it hurt? Stay with me. You'll be okay. Help is coming. But I never saw the three people from the manager's room who were consumed by flames. I kept thinking, I'm sorry. It's my fault. Even as my heart felt like it would break, I continued providing aid. The works we created will never disappear. I take immense pride in the fact that I was able to create those works with everyone. Creating works is a battle between schedules and quality, but we pour our hearts in it to deliver our creations to those who watch them. I hope such a tragedy never happens again. I also hope a heavy judgment, befitting the lives lost, will be rendered. So next up in the trial, it came to the hearing of witness testimonies, and there's a lot of these to go through, so I've picked out just one particularly pertinent example for you, which would be that of firefighter commander on the ground on the 18th of July. Again, I'm censoring his name because while his name is public, I didn't come across anything where he explicitly stated that he was happy to have his name tied to the case. Quote, at the time I was working for the Yamashima fire station in Kyoto City and was dispatched as the commander of the response team to the Kyoto Animation fire. At 10:38 a.m., the Yamashina command team was instructed to prepare for emergency response, and we arrived at 10:48 a.m. By then, many firefighters were already rushing around the scene. Our vehicle couldn't reach the location due to the residential street, so we parked nearby and ran to the site. A command post was set up on the eastern side of the scene, and firefighting efforts were already underway. In the visible area, I identified 7 to 8 individuals lying or sitting down, their hair, clothes, and skin severely burned, and nearby residents were trying to encourage them. From this, it was immediately apparent that the damage was extensive. Despite it being a daytime fire, the 3-story building had flames and black smoke pouring out of the windows, and it was clear from the overwhelming spread of the fire that it was no ordinary blaze. Among the injured were evacuees who continued to gather at the scene. There were people with severe burns, others bleeding heavily, and some in shock, unable to open their eyes or respond to voices. The site was chaotic, filled with shouting and confusion. The Fushimi command team leading the operation had already determined that 30 individuals were trapped and unable to escape. As time passed, it became clear that survival and rescue were unlikely. While it was the time to begin discovering bodies, instructions were given to halt the removal of remains as they could not be placed in the first aid area. Firefighters crawled on the floor during their search, fully aware of the large number of casualties. I too confirmed the presence of numerous bodies. In my 35 years as a firefighter, I've never encountered such a horrific scene with so many victims. I doubt there has been an incident with such a high number of casualties anywhere else in Japan. Now, there's lots more I could give you, but as the word count is starting to get a little out of hand already with this script, let us just use this one exemplar. It was testimony after testimony that fully laid out how utterly horrific the fire had been. For similar reasons, a word count coupled with the fact that it was an open and shut case and thus isn't the most interesting of things to dwell on, I shall also not tell you too much about the evidence that was presented. They had CCTV footage of both the build-up and execution of the attack, witness testimony from survivors and witnesses, DNA evidence from the jerry cans, as well as the stashed knives, and a whole heap of circumstantial evidence, such as the receipts from the petrol station, hardware shop, and even the public transport that brought Zako to the scene of his crime. So there was no doubt at all that he was the man who had done it. With a body of evidence like this, a misidentification was simply impossible, and that's the real takeaway. And with that said, we now arrive at the crux of this chapter, the sentencing. Obviously he was found guilty, but what sentence did he get? That's the question. Because don't forget, folks, Japan, being the based and enlightened land that it is, has the death penalty. So here are Judge Masuda's sentencing remarks. The defendant specifically chose methods to maximize casualties, referencing past incidents, and opted for arson with gasoline, fully aware of the risks. Targeting Studio 1, where a large number of people worked, he prepared 6 knives, researched the location online, and procured gasoline containers and gas lighters from a hardware store. To ensure the attack's success, he minimized interactions with others and chose the time of 10:30 a.m. when employees were seated and absorbed in their work. Despite lingering in the alley for several minutes and seeing the employees diligently working, he had multiple opportunities to reconsider, yet he never wavered, maintaining his firm intent to kill as many people as possible up until the moment he committed the attack. The deep sorrow and anguish of the victims and their families are overwhelming, and their desire for punishment is intense. These factors, directly related to the crime, must be carefully considered. During the trial, the defendant expressed remorse by saying, "I'm sorry." However, this brief statement was shallow and lacked genuine reflection. Even in the final stages of the trial, the defendant continued to shift responsibility onto the victims, aggravating the feelings of the bereaved families. He showed no signs of providing consolation to the victims' families, nor is there any expectation of such actions in the future. There are no circumstances that would be considered favorable for the defendant. Considering these factors, including those potentially favorable to the defendant, his criminal responsibility remains exceedingly grave. Even under the principle of proportionality in sentencing, this case, an unparalleled mass arson murder with an extraordinarily high victim count, requires the harshest punishment. Additionally, from the perspective of general deterrence, the case's significant social impact can't be ignored. Therefore, the appropriate sentence is to impose the death penalty on the defendant. Hey, he's getting death penalty, he's getting a room with the trapdoor. And look, I quite agree on the appropriateness of that sentence too, Judge Masuda. Me too. George, Judge, and Simon all in agreement. For 3 years, I've been writing for this show, slowly becoming more and more convinced of the necessity of the death penalty, as I deal with ever more perverse and wicked criminals, only to find myself bitterly disappointed as we learn yet again, because both the UK and Hong Kong abolished the death penalty in 1964 and 1966 respectively, the loathsome piece of human excrement in question is going to get to live out the rest of the days watching telly and enjoying 3 square meals a day at the taxpayer's expense. But today, finally, one of these stories is going to end in a way that I would like, with death. And so, on the 25th of January, 2024, basically a year ago to the day, almost, 3 days difference. Physically deflated from the consequences of his own actions, delivering him a right hook to both firm and righteous, straight into the jaw, he was dragged out of the courthouse by 2 prison officers, ready for his long overdue meeting with fate. Are they really going to execute him this quickly? I was reading an article yesterday on BBC, and it was like, China execute someone for something. Can't remember what it was. But he'd been convicted of the crime in December. It's a month later he's executed. In the US, they're waiting for decades as appeals process runs out and all that. China are 30 days, mate. Out you go. Shot in the head. Chapter 5. On the death penalty in Japan. As of the time of writing, the Grim Reaper sharpens his scythe for Zako still, and he remains one of the 107 people on Japanese death row. Oh, he's still alive. Okay, and I don't know about you all, but before I started researching this script, I knew the sum total of bugger all about Japanese death row, and so I naturally found myself with quite a few questions that I wanted answering. Things like, how do prisoners on it actually live, and what are their conditions like? As well as others, such as, how do they do the deed, as it were? They drop them. It's a hanging thing. I know this. I feel like this has come up in a previous video. I certainly didn't want to make any assumptions in these grounds, not least due to the fact that the two places I've lived, UK and Hong Kong, both abolished it in the 60s, and I have no personal frame of reference. So with all of that in mind, I set to doing some homework, both about Japanese death row generally and Zako's place within it more specifically, and here's what I found. It turns out that once a death sentence is finalized in Japan, the condemned does not go to prison, but rather they go to a detention center, or a kokushio, which is a Japanese legalese distinction that basically just means prison, but for those awaiting finalization of proceedings. Finalization of proceedings. Be those proceedings awaiting trial, sentencing, appeals, or indeed execution. For a normal prisoner, i.e. one who had gone through the court system and is now just sitting out a custodial sentence, they would go to a kimusho, which is just your regular prison. Or at least I think that's how it works. The whole execution being a finalization of proceedings thing, akin to sentencing or appeals, just screams at me as something I've misunderstood, so apologies to our Japanese viewers if I've got that wrong. No, I can understand how the system would come out that way. Your culture is an illustrious one, make no mistake, but my god, can its finer points be confusing to neophyte. Yeah, maybe I'm sure with our viewer numbers, there's someone from Japan watching in the and would leave a comment. Let us know. One thing I do know for certain, however, is that regardless of the finer points of what a kokushio is or isn't, there are 7 of them in Japan that come loaded with death row facilities, specifically in Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Fukuoka, Hiroshima, Sendai, and Sapporo. I'm pleased to report that from what I've read, the experience on Japanese death row isn't exactly free PlayStations and access to endless opportunities that tax-paying Japanese citizens have to save up and pay for. Inmates are instead confined to small, sparse cells, usually about 5 square meters in size, where they live in near total isolation. Interacting with other inmates is forbidden, and their communication is limited to guards, lawyers, and approved family visits, and even those interactions are rare and carefully monitored. Sounds like they're basically dead already. Life on Japanese death row is also governed by strict routines and a near monastic level of control. The day is structured around fixed schedules for meals, hygiene, and a brief period of outdoor exercise in a small enclosed courtyard. Inmates may occupy themselves with permitted activities such as reading, writing, or practicing simple hobbies like origami or calligraphy. How very Japanese, but every action requires permission. Your Honor, I'd like to have a please, I need to have a I don't know why I said Your Honor. It'd be just like God, wouldn't it? God! Silence is also the rule for most of the day, and even minor infractions can result in punishment and the loss of what few privileges they have. No shitting for you today! Personal belongings are limited to the bare essentials, basic toiletries, writing materials, and a few approved personal items. Is in existence stripped to its starkest elements, with little to distract from the inevitability of what lies ahead. Some would point to such conditions and condemn the Japanese system, but not me. I've long since said on this channel that I'm well in favor of the death penalty for extreme violent crime if it's backed by a body of evidence so vast and all-encompassing that their being guilty becomes a matter of objective fact. At that point, if you ask me, not only should their pre-execution incarceration be horrible, but it should be so horrible that the condemned come to envy the dead. Zako killed 36 people, so f*** him. Human rights should be reserved for humans, not demons, at least as I see it. I disagree there. Ironically, I kind of have come around on the death penalty as being something that does have its place, but, so that's going to sound very contradictory to the idea that I think prisoners should be kept in humane conditions. Unless it's Pedro Lopez. That aside, we haven't even got to the best bit of Japanese death row yet, folks. Best if you're in favor of it anyway. And that'd be the actual execution itself. Obviously, it's quite the normal affair, or as normal as an execution could be anyway. They're led into a room, their neck is shoved in a noose, the floor falls away, and they go all dingly-dangly for a time, and then Lady Justice looks and smiles, knowing that the tragic soul before her has earned their absolution. Where it gets really good, however, at least for the more hardcore death penalty enjoyers such as myself, what am I missing? Is that when the appeals run dry and the date of execution is settled upon, the condemned is not told until the morning of the execution. As a result, they sit there, wallowing, often for years at a time, wondering if tomorrow will be their final day. English language articles that discuss this are quick to point out this causes profound mental health issues due to the prolonged isolation and constant fear of the unknown. That is inhumane. Like, as much as I want this guy to go to the little room and have the floor drop out from underneath him, this is just really, it's kind of torturous, and I'm not into torture. I think that's my line. I'm not into torture, but death penalty sometimes. And you know what I say to that? Good. I don't want to spend every day sitting in a grotty cell contemplating your own mortality, then don't kill 36 people. Okay, George and I, difference of opinion there. Like, I'm just I'm just known to torture. Similarly, the families of the condemned are not informed until after the execution. But if you're anything like me, folks, while Zako eventually being sent to the rope in this way will bring you no end of joy, you worry for the mental health of the prison guards. They are just salt of the earth salary men and women with mortgages and kids that need to get through school. After all, it isn't right that they should have to look down at their hands and see them stained with blood just for carrying out a task that, while grisly, is viewed as necessary by both I and 80.8% of the Japanese population by recent polling. Holy that's an overwhelming majority. Well, it turns out that the Japanese Correction Bureau of the Ministry of Justice agrees, and to preserve the mental health of their prison officers, when the time comes to do the deed, the trapdoor is activated by an electronic button, which is pushed at the exact same time as two identical dummy buttons, with no one involved in the execution being told which is the live one. Thus, no one knows for certain who actually killed the condemned, and officers involved have enough separation from the event to keep their psyche intact. Fascinating. George has an aside here. I also have a slight tangent to discuss something related to this, which has bugged me for years. Okay. You know how someone is executed by firing squad, it's commonly believed that only one of the executioners is given a live round, with the rest being blanks. No. Aren't they all given live rounds, except one being given a blank, so there's just that potential doubt, but then they're also getting shot multiple times, so that they're more likely to die rather than the one person miss? Wait. Let me read that. You know, it's commonly believed that only one of the executioners is given a live round. No. Wait, no, it should be the other way around. Am I missing something? Don't most people think that it's just one empty gun, not... Have I got this completely wrong? With the rest being given blanks, so that much like the Japanese button system, no one knows who actually killed them. Well, this idea is direly misunderstood in both directions, and I'd like to clear it up. Okay. Essentially, the reality of this idea hinges around the type of blanks that are actually fired. For example, when Eddie Slovic, the only American soldier executed for desertion since the Civil War, was shot, it was done using a Type 3006 blank, in which the head of the bullet is formed into the actual casing and crimped. So you'd pull the trigger, get a big bang, the gas produced by burn propellant leaving the barrel, but that's it. The recoil produced from this is tiny, as in, even if you're slightly in shape, you'll swear there was no recoil at all tiny, as there's no massive projectile leaving the muzzle to push the weapon back in line with Newton's third law, which is what causes the bulk of recoil normally. I can vouch for this personally too. I've shot all manner of stuff with blanks over the years. And this point in the explanation, many often leap to their feet with enthusiasm and say, aha! The whole blank round to spare their feelings thing is twaddle then. Okay. I realize, I've thought about this so many times, but never considered this. And that's why I say it's misunderstood in both directions, and stress that it depends upon the type of blank being used. As in World War I, the British used a Type 303 blank, which simply had a wooden bullet in place of a metal one that fell apart when it left the muzzle. This would mean that their recoil-operated Vickers gun would still cycle as the round blocks the barrel, creating the back pressure needed to actuate the action, but most crucially, for our purposes, it'll still create recoil as there's now a mass being pushed forward, creating force in the opposing direction. Very clever. With that sort of round, it is totally conceivable that only one live round could be loaded to save the soldiers' feelings when executing their comrades for desertion. So conceivable, in fact, that the US state of Utah actually does this when it comes time to execute someone by firing squad, albeit with wax projectiles rather than wooden ones, but same difference. And with that finally cleared up after many years of my wanting to, back to the main script. Wait, now I'm curious. Is it... I'll ask ChatGPT. Yeah, ChatGPT, what's up? When someone's executed by firing squad, am I wrong in thinking that all of the members of the firing squad have live rounds except for one, or is it that everyone has blanks except for one? Which way round is it?
The typical practice is that all but one or two members of the firing squad have live rounds, while the rest have blanks. This way, none of the shooters...
What? My whole life I just thought one guy didn't have the bullet and he was getting riddled with bullets from the other guys. Holy shit, okay. Chapter 6. A bit of armchair psychology. And now, folks, we get to the reason why I went into Zako's backstory earlier on in today's episode, because I'm absolutely dead set on hiding his name from you so that, touchwood, it could be forgotten and expunged from the pages of history with all warranted haste. I didn't want the show's takeaway to be just evil guy does terrible thing, woe and betide the whole situation. Instead, I wanted us to hopefully be able to understand exactly what it is that makes a man such as him, which strikes me as a far more useful takeaway, and unfortunately doing so necessitates knowing his backstory. Now make no mistake, even as I type this, I have my doubts over whether this was the correct call, and no doubt will continue to do so even as I hit Control-S for the last time and send the script over to Simon. But having thought on the matter for a few days, I can only trust my gut that this approach is a respectful one. I've hidden Zako's real name, and have gone to great lengths to respect the privacy of both the victims and those who were otherwise involved in the story. I think this is fine. So, with myself now largely convinced that this chapter isn't going to lead to the desecration of 36 graves, let's get to the matter at hand. Yeah, I think I don't think this is distasteful in any way. I think it's important to, this guy. I think absolutely anyone listening agrees with that. But if we don't learn anything, if there's no takeaway, if there's no attempt to decode his thinking, then it feels like an incomplete story. And not that the story is the most important thing here. I think being respectful probably trumps story. But it's an incomplete tale. To understand why Zako carried out his heinous attack, we must first consider the findings of his psychiatric evaluation as undertaken by the prosecutors prior to his trial. It concluded that Zako was suffering from 2 severe delusional disorders at the time of the incident, specifically paranoid personality disorder, PPD, and delusional disorder, or DD. As for what they actually are, PPD is characterized by a pervasive distrust and suspicion of others, which leads to individuals with it routinely misjudging others' motives as malevolence near universally. People with PPD are also hypersensitive to perceived slights or criticism, which can make relationships and social interactions challenging. DD, on the other hand, involves the presence of persistent, non-bizarre delusions, i.e. false beliefs, perceptions, and interpretations that are plausible but unfounded, such as believing one is being persecuted or conspired against. Unlike other psychotic disorders, individuals with DD typically do not experience broader impairments in reality or bizarre behavior outside of their delusions. Okay. So, I mean, he definitely had something wrong with him, didn't he? In the court's opinion, these mental illnesses profoundly shaped his perception of reality, with him eventually snowballing sufficiently that his entire perception of reality was warped and bastardized, which led him to developing the belief that Kyoto Animation had both ripped off his work and was going out of its way to target him, thus giving him his motive. I feel like this should be considered in the sentencing. Like he doesn't seem well. Do note, however, because this is very important, that as far as the court was concerned, all this explanation represented was a recognition of cause and effect, i.e. X happening which created Y and then led to Z choice being made. It was not an explanation of mitigated culpability or diminished responsibility, and nor would any such explanation ever be given, because in the opinion of the psychologist who undertook Zako's analysis, while sure his condition certainly impaired his judgment to a degree, his inability to control his actions, understand their implications, as well as process morality more broadly, still very much intact. Okay, fair enough. There we go. I'll take the expert's opinion on that. Sure, his condition had led him to legitimately believing that Kyoto Animation had stolen his work. Yeah, but even if that was true, this is not a proportionate response. But the resulting choice to pour petrol in one of their studios and then ignite it, that was all him, as the court psychologist saw it. And I see it. Yeah, I think that's fair. That's very fair. From all the schadenfreude I was soaking up earlier on in the episode, when we were discussing Zako's injuries and impending execution, I'm sure you've all deduced that I happen to agree with the court psychologist. I would like to say, however, that I did actually go into this story with an open mind, and while I was aware of what Zako had done, I was perfectly willing, dare I say, even ready and prepared to discover that he suffered with something like dissociative identity disorder, DID, or schizophrenia, at which point, particularly if it was a variety that came with elements of psychosis too, I would have been happy to accept diminished responsibility, genuinely wish him well on his recovery, and thoroughly condemn the Japanese judiciary's choice to execute him. Yeah, of course. Like, if someone is... this is the thing, it's a spectrum. And these disorders, it seems that the psychologist is, these are not enough to mitigate the actions that he took. But if he was genuinely unaware of his actions, or was thinking, he's burning down the devil's house in schizophrenia or something like that, then sure. That's potentially a defense. To explain what I mean further, take DID as an example, with it being characterized by the presence of 2 or more distinct identities or personality states within a single individual, which they legitimately fully switch between. I would have had no problem at all arguing for Zako's being of diminished responsibility had his body committed the wicked deed, while one of his alters, the correct psychology ease for those different identities, being at the reins at the time. As for schizophrenia, it is characterized by episodes of losing touch with reality, often involving hallucinations, delusions, and disorganized thinking. The hallucinations, typically auditory, manifest as hearing voices that may comment, command, or converse, while delusions are fixed false beliefs such as paranoia or grandiosity, and the disorganized thought patterns lead to incoherent speech, difficulty maintaining focus, emotional flatness, reduced motivation, and social withdrawal, which persists between episodes. So again, as with DID, by my mind, schizophrenia could have been grounds for diminished responsibility depending upon the specifics of how it manifested. Yeah, George and I are on exactly George and I have not been on the same page about everything today, but we're definitely on the same page about this. But of course, Zako ultimately had neither schizophrenia nor DID. He had PPD and DD, and all they did to his mind was make him think that Kyoto Animation was ripping off his work and flipping them the middle finger while doing so. He then chose, of his own volition, to react to that incorrect reality in a way that was disproportionate and in a way that I even struggled to put into words. Knowing that, there is no other conclusion I can render other than his simply being an evil piece of shit, malevolent by his very nature and incapable of existence in civilized society. Even if he didn't have PPD and DD, the mental programming for violent disproportionality was still there as I see it, and sooner or later, someone or something would have really wronged him in a way he believed that Kyoto Animation had, and then it'd have done something equally heinous in response anyway. And George has a long note here, George. You got a page of notes? Alright, it starts with a pertinent tangent, so I'll give it to you, George. Let's go. That may help you get your heads around my musings on Zako's mental health. I was reluctant to mention this, partly because it felt like oversharing that few of you would care about, but mostly just because discussing such things on public platforms is, frankly, just a bit bum-squeaky. You see, your boy, as prescribed by the gallant guys and gals of His Majesty's National Health Service, happens to be an enjoyer of the old bipolar disorder, which for those not in the know is the one where your brain straps your emotions into a roller coaster and sends them rocketing up and down between extreme highs and lows, which, at its most extreme, can become episodes of mania and depression, per the technical psychologies. It's a bit like trying to describe colour to a creature born without eyes, but when I'm in either a depressive or manic episode, which is rare nowadays as I've worked very hard to get command of the condition, my choices are still my own. They're just amplified by greater extremes of emotion. For me at least, it's actually quite a peculiar thing to experience, because my rationality is still in there, offering input on my emotions and how sensible heeding them may or may not be, but what it says just doesn't form a part of the decision-making in the way that it normally would. It's a very difficult thing to explain, but I'm sure you'll see what I'm getting at. I do indeed. But in saying that, just over the horizon I can spot another level to my episodes where they become so extreme that psychosis would come into play, and suddenly you're dealing with a whole other beast where episodes of mine could become just a bit more, well, more. That's the only way I can describe it, and suddenly I legitimately wouldn't be able to be the person typing these words for you now, either in action or command. And that's exactly why I focused on Zako's being in control of himself when deciding whether I admonish him and give the devil a bell to reserve him prime seats down in hell, or argue what I feel to be quite the unpopular opinion and say I'd actually be for him just getting the help he would need in a secure setting, because from my own experience, I have an awareness of how while mental health conditions don't intrinsically define who you are or dictate your actions, they can reach a point where they become so severe that a whole new metric and way of thinking about them has to be applied. Yeah, I entirely agree. George and I are... maybe people listening to this are on a different page, but I think this is just an obvious... no offense, George, I don't mean to say that. Yeah, obviously, George. You don't have to have this special... You don't have to have this condition to see this. But I don't know. I'm just kind of... in a very backwards way, saying that I agree with you. Oh, while we're here, let's do a cheeky mental health PSA. If your nuts a bit on the wobble, just do yourself a favor and get the ball rolling and get it seen to. Believe me, I know it seems terrifying, but take it from a guy who just talked about his bipolar disorder in potentially front of millions of people. Life gets so much better when you just accept it for what it is and start viewing a mental ailment in exactly the same terms as you would a physical one, i.e. as little but a hurdle you need to jump so you can actually get on living your life. And I'm not going to personally overshare here because it's not my personal thing, but just to say that George is absolutely f***ing right. And further, if you're worried about social stigma, don't be. Right again. You know how many negative comments I've had since being more open about my mental health? Not a single one. People, on their default setting, are good and kind, and those around you will want nothing more than to see you flourish. So please, for them, for me, and above all else, get help if you're struggling. Yeah, just f***ing do it. You won't regret it. And yeah, it's scary, but you should do it. You feel a lot better afterwards. So to get back things on track after that long tangent, if Zako's choice to attack Studio One cannot be explained by his mental health, and we're working on the assumption that he was just an evil little turd of a man, what made him that way? It's a big question, isn't it? One so big, in fact, that even with the whole being a Z-list internet celebrity thing blowing my EU out of proportions hitherto unknown among mortal men, I would never be so bold as to assume that I could possibly answer such a question. With that in mind, I put news aggregators, totally legal book download sites, And the interlibrary loans lady at my local library to her, gathering text far and wide to see what the clever sorts of the psychology world had to say. Let's start by looking at a chap called James Knoll, a forensic psychiatrist, authority on the psychology of mass violence, and a man whose brain has more wrinkles than I've had hot dinners. He speaks on mass murderers such as Zako, not that he referenced him specifically. This is me applying his writings to our case today, as so-called pseudo-commandos. A term I shall let him explain himself with the following extract from a 2010 paper. The term pseudo-commando was used by Dietz in 1986 to describe a type of mass murderer who plans his actions after long deliberation. The pseudo-commando often kills indiscriminately in public during the daytime, but may also kill family members and a pseudo-community he believes has mistreated him. He comes prepared with a powerful arsenal of weapons and has no escape planned. Such persons are collectors of injustice who nurture their wounded narcissism and retreat into a fantasy life of violence and revenge, quote ends. And I don't know about you folks, but I think we could be onto an answer with this pseudo-commando idea. Long deliberation, check. Zako literally spent days staring at Studio One. Killing members of a pseudo-community he believes mistreated him, check again, because I'll be damned if it isn't just the perfect description of how Zako felt about Kyoto Animation. No escape planned, big check, as Zako had intended to die in the attack. Retreating into a fantasy life. Scribble that check so hard you go through paper, as Zako wasn't exactly connected to reality before the attack, and the powerful arsenal bit, given that Japan isn't exactly Texas or Switzerland, I'd say that he checked that box as well. Yeah, I mean, he had 6 knives on him and 40 litres of petrol. That's armed up. Yeah. Powerful arsenal. But while that extract from Knoll was great for establishing the characteristics that define a pseudo-commando, it was rather lacking on the why front, not with the line about being collectors of injustice giving us the only most surface level of an idea. With that in mind, let's take a look at some of the other papers and see exactly what makes someone walk the path of pseudo-commando. Initially, we might be tempted, such a bizarre word. Initially, we might be tempted to go back to the earliest usage of the term, which in this case would be in Dietz's 1986 paper, Mass Serial and Sensational Homicides, the same one that Knoll referred to, but doing so wouldn't actually be that expedient, as, like most early iterations of an idea, be it intellectual or physical, it's rather crude and unrefined, having little to offer other than the base definition that we've already seen. Instead, let's look at a more modern and far more tarted-up discourse on the matter, specifically pseudo-commander mass murderers, a Big Five personality profile using psycholinguistics, which was jointly authored by Madeline Cott, Paul Reed, and Benjamin Walker, published in 2021. Quote, pseudo-commandos were angry, perceived themselves as highly persecuted, and severely lacked self-esteem. They brood over feelings of rejection and failure, channeling their frustration into an attack on the community they perceived to have ostracized them. They plan to enact a statement and gain back the elusive feeling of control. Crimogenic factors in pseudo-commandos, such as dysfunctional family bonds, lack of social support, and past antisocial behavior have been researched, and the motivating factor for the attack is often expressed as revenge for social rejection. And while there was a bit of a dry extract, yeah, I might have turned it off a little bit in my head. It's academic writing, what are you going to do? But there was some good stuff in there. And now that we know pseudo-commandos like Zako are made from a vicious cocktail of very specific ingredients, no self-confidence, anger, envy, repeated hearings of the word no, a lack of support structures to rein them in, a want for scapegoats for their situation, prior criminality, and a victim complex, you mix all of those together, and seemingly in some people it will either create or activate the evil programming, creating the kind of monster that could walk into an animation studio and kill 36 people. And while we've come a long way from my initial proclamation of, here's what I reckon, he was evil, yes, I'm still not quite satisfied. Sure, we now know the environmental conditions that create a Zako, but it isn't that simple, is it? As it isn't the case that every person who happens to meet those criteria will snap and go on a rampage. And I can say from personal experience, as I can think of at least 3 of my bros who found themselves in an identical situation in their early to mid-20s and yet totally managed to turn their lives around without harming so much as a hair on someone else's head. So clearly something more must be needed to get someone to cross that Rubicon. But what? Cursed as I am with a brain smooth as custard, I once again turned to a learned sort in search of my answer, specifically Gillian Peterson, who, as a professor of criminology and criminal justice at Hamline University and a go-to expert on the very question of what makes someone snap, is the sort of person we can trust to see us right. That's got to be a fascinating area of research. Just working out what makes people snap, what has led people to just going just from hey, everything's normal to being and now I'm shooting up a park. She posits that the process is one of pathways, where individuals are led to commit acts of mass violence through a series of causal and exponentially more mentally toxic choices, which she identified by looking at mass shooters in the US. Among the most significant factors she identified were early life trauma, which get the ball rolling down the path to carrying out a massacre, and noticeable behavioral crises in the period leading up to their actions, which lock it in, as it were. These elements, while not deterministic, demonstrably correlate and come up time and time again whenever the history of a spree killer is being dissected. As for what early life trauma can be more specifically, Peterson specifically picks out abuse, both sexual and physical, neglect, or the loss of a parent through suicide or abandonment. Once again, folks, you've got to admit how uncannily this lines up with what we've learned about Zako's early life. God, it's bang on, isn't it? According to Peterson, exposure to such trauma at an early age creates a long-lived psychological burden, disrupting the child's normal and healthy emotional and cognitive development. Some, just as those bros of mine I know personally, will recognize the destructive path they're on and, through arduous emotional labor, overcome their trauma and emerge stronger for it. But others, like Zako, well, the scars set deep and they never heal, becoming a foundation for later negative and maladaptive behaviors, i.e. because they don't know how to healthily deal with emotions such as resentment, envy, and hopelessness. They never get processed, they just pile up, snowballing to the point where they dominate one's psyche. This, according to Peterson, leaves someone as a powder keg ready to blow, and in the same way that the proverbial packed powder needs a spark to set it off, so does a person. Yeah, that's where the studying of the snap comes in, isn't it? These notable behavioral crises, as Peterson refers to them, are simply when trauma can be repressed no longer, and so begin to spill out into someone's behavior in an immediate and very pronounced manner. So telling are these crises that research undertaken by Peterson shows 82% of massacre perpetrators in the US were noted as having such an episode in the immediate lead up to their attack. I mean, but the thing is, people also have crises, like fairly regularly, or nervous breakdowns, or whatever you want to call them, and they don't go on to massacre anyone. So you'd think, oh, let's keep an eye on these people who have this. And it's like, yeah, but most of them are just going to go on and just be like, oh yeah, it's okay. In real terms, Peterson goes on, this is the point of no return for the execution of a massacre. And if it isn't nipped in the bud immediately by external actors, the attack is coming. Simple as. As for what such a snap looks like from the outside looking in, signs can include everything from increased aggression, paranoia, agitation, as well as jumpy, erratic, and skittish behavior, as well as any combination of the aforementioned list coming together in a horrific union. Very importantly too, Peterson stresses, these crises typically correlate with specific external stresses that exacerbate an individual's underlying distress. Say someone is dealing with demons, and despite all their day-by-day ups and downs, they're keeping a lid on it and coping. But then they lose their job. They go home to find their partner's things gone and a note on the coffee table, or suffer a public humiliation of any kind. The pressure then builds up hard and fast, and the lid is sent flying off into the distance, from where it may never be able to contain what was within ever again. And with all of that, I believe we have arrived at a suitably fleshed out and satisfactory answer. Zako became a pseudo-commando, a very specific type of mass murderer, because he had unresolved trauma in his formative years that, through his own actions in isolating himself, was left to fester and build over the course of many years until the pot totally boiled over and he took it out on 36 innocent people. There are other potential explanations, of course. This is just one I found most satisfactory in my reading, and because I'm certainly not bold enough to assume a monopoly on the truth. Let me now put it to Simon, and indeed all of you in the audience. Do you find my explanation satisfactory, or do you need any other ideas that could offer insight? No, I think it's pretty nail on the head. Well done, George. Chapter 7. The Victims. And now we arrive at the final and most important chapter, the one where we cast the loathsome creature who carried out the attack from our minds and focus on the victims. I'll not be mentioning all of them, as much as I'd like to, as you have no doubt ascertained by now the Japanese take privacy very seriously. So despite the fact that all of these victims' names are known and can be found at this point, I will verge on the side of caution, only mention those who I can find explicit confirmation that their family were comfortable with their being named. Further still, having spoken with this episode's cultural consultant, more on that in the later appendices, I am aware that Japanese eulogies tend to focus on the core things like name and age, and then go into detail about professional achievements rather than details of their personal life. Knowing that, I will be doing mine in a similar way, and only mentioning personal details if they have been specifically released by the family. I just wish to point that out in case my focusing on their careers first and foremost only came out as insensitive. So with that said, let's begin the chapter proper. First, there's Yuka Kusama. It had been a long-standing policy of Kyoto Animation to pounce on promising graduates from universities and throw them into the deep end, mentoring under their veteran animators, and Yuka was one such promising graduate, having only joined the company in the spring of 2019. Naturally, given how fresh she was to the company, she hadn't had the chance to stamp her name onto much, with her only credit being as a support animator on Violet Evergarden the movie. Despite this, however, I can firmly say that she had a promising future stolen from her, as not only did surviving staff members speak very highly of her and her work, but an old professor of hers from Osaka Seiki University also released her thesis project to the public, and having had a look at it, it's legitimately very good stuff for someone who at that point wasn't even out of university. She was 22 at the time of her murder. Tragically, Yuka wasn't the only new recruit who was lost, and our next victim, Yuki Amura, was only 22 at the time of his murder, and had only joined Kyoto Animation that year, following his graduation from Tohoku University. He had a most promising future ahead of him, as evidenced by the fact that he had won himself 7 awards at the 2018 Nika 10 exhibition, a yearly competition held to seek out promising new animation talent. I looked up what he submitted, and Dokun Dokun, as he called it, is top stuff for someone of his age, being a kind of very well-done animated scroll of the history of life on Earth. Like Yuka, his short time spent working for Kyoto Animation meant that he too only managed to get 1 credit to his name, and that was also for Violet Evergarden, on which he worked as a support animator. Closely connected to both Yuka and Yuki was the third victim, Yoshiji Kagama, but he was one of the master animators who took the new graduates under his wing and provided a set of learned training wheels as they got their tentative starts in professional animation. Frankly, I'm spoiled for choice when picking out highlights from his career. The man was a giant of both Kyoto Animation and of the whole anime scene. For the sake of the lay folk of the audience, however, I'll draw your attention to some of his earlier works, which you're more likely to have heard of, specifically the Studio Ghibli classic, Grave of the Fireflies, which I'm unironically in tears over just for remembering it exists and is legitimately one of the most emotive things ever committed to film, and Akira, the 80s cyberpunk much-watch classic. He served as key animator on both of them. He was 61. Another of Kyoto's animation giants lost that day was Yasuhiro Takemoto, who was 47 at the time of his murder. Having first signed on with the company back in 1996, he spent all but 3 years of his professional life in their employ, having started out as a key animator on now classic shows such as Master of Mosquiton and Tenchi Universe, before eventually climbing the ladder and breaking into directing with 2003's Full Metal Panic, Fumofu. The sky was the limit for him from there, and with him stacking up directing credits for a myriad of shows such as The Melancholy of Harushi Suzumiya, Miss Kobayashi's Dragon Maid. Beyond well-regarded, both within Kyoto Animation and the anime community more generally, Kyoto Animation's current president and chief executive officer, Hata Hideaki, freely admits that Yasuhiro left a hole in the company that is yet to be filled, if it ever will be. And then there is Junichi Uda, who was 34 at the time of his murder. Having joined Kyoto Animation back in 2009, he had 10 years of service under his belt, and so was nicely settled into his career. As for what he did, he was an in-between animator. It was his job to make sure that the transitions between cells and shots were nice and smooth, and having consumed more than my fair share of his titles, with personal highlights being Love, Chinabiyu, and Other Delusions, and the disappearance of Haruhi Suzumiya, I can personally vouch that he was very good at what he did. Unfortunately, other information about him is few and far between, so there's nothing more for us to do than thank him for his diligence and wish his spirit Godspeed. And next let us consider Futoshi Nishiya, who signed straight on with Kyoto Animation in 2003, having completed a vocational course in animation at a college in Osaka. Simply exceptional at his chosen trade, Futoshi quickly rocketed up the ranks of the studio, finding himself a key animator before 2003 was even up, and dabbling in directing not even 3 years later. But while he would keep toes in both of those pools as fresh calendars came and went from his office wall, he would eventually find his real calling: character design, with him first taking on the task for 2011's Nichijo, and subsequently going on to sketch out and bring to life some of Kyoto Animation's most iconic characters from the 2010s, some of which, on a personal note, are currently in my man cave in shrunken plastic form. He was 37 at the time of his murder. For Seiichi Tsuda, who was 41, we're able to speak not just of her professional achievements, but also of her as a woman, as her father spoke to the media extensively after her murder. He spoke of her loss as a second sucker punch of piling tragedy, for he had only recently become widowed when his neighborhood police officer knocked on his door, cap in hand, to deliver the tragic news about Seiichi. He spoke of the 41 years of life that she did get to enjoy with immense pride, As for Seichi, there was never any career but animation, with her father remembering how she would while away her days sketching anime characters in the back of her notebooks before eventually making her way to a technical school to studio animation and eventually settling in with Kyoto Animation, who she would work for from the year 2000. As for what she worked on at Kyoto Animation, Seichi had some good works to her name serving as a digital painter, i.e. the person who adds colour and shading to line sketches for Nurse Witch Komuji-chan and Canon, to name just a few, before then climbing the ladder and becoming a special effects artist, i.e. the person who puts it all on a computer at the final stage of production, on both Free, Dive to the Future, and its movie capper, Free, Take Your Marks. And that brings us to the end of the obituaries, and indeed the end of today's episode, which was very long. A case like this brings out all manner of emotions, as you've seen reflected in myself, no doubt, but rather than waffling on and trying to tie it all up in a neat little bow, let me instead close by, being short and sweet, by drawing attention to one particular thing that I feel says it all. The 7 victims that I felt confident enough to commemorate by name, they didn't even represent 20% of the attack's total death toll. So wanton and unprecedented was it in its brutality. May all 36 of them continue to live on for time immemorial through both the cherished memories their lives form a part of and through their work, which continues to be revered to this day and will no doubt continue to be long into the future. Dismembered appendices. So we find ourselves at the part of the video where I explain my research methodology to you all. As always, I wanted to hold no bars with me going into this with my usual aim of producing the most detailed and best research piece available on YouTube for the case in question. Unfortunately, doing so presented a challenge because I'm not exactly what you would call born and bred Japanese. I bet George, he is not. He's also called George. Nor even a long since settled and integrated immigrant. If anything, I'm still very much at the enthusiastic tourist stage of my understanding and appreciation of Japanese culture, which naturally made me a bit paranoid about misunderstanding cultural nuances that could be key to understanding the case, or just flatly not being able to access sources, as I do not trust Google Translate to do the job for anything even slightly complex or difficult. No, Google Translate can drop the ball pretty hard. Fortunately, however, I found salvation in the form of Yukino, a lady who, for the past 6 months, I've been paying to perform a task most unenviable, trying to cram her native language into my oh-so-smooth brain. I asked her a couple of points of interest at the end of one of my lessons, which led to me telling her I pay my mortgage, which then snowballed rather out of control, and led to her coming onto my books as a contractor for translation and cultural consulting. She has been nothing short of a godsend, and without her aid, you flatly wouldn't have gotten today's episode to enjoy as long as I'd have long since binned it off for being unable to reach my standard. As for what I sent her to translate, then used to write this script, the bulk of the story I compiled from a myriad of different Japanese news outlets, which quite naturally reported on the case in way greater detail than any English outlet did. And the gaps in that were filled in by extra details that I found in official press releases by the Kyoto Police and Fire Department, the Kyoto District Court, and of course, Kyoto Animation themselves. I did also find one useful book on the matter, specifically Report, Kyoto Animation Arson Murder Case by the Asahi Shimbun Investigative Team. With an author credit like that, and the fact that it only came out 6 weeks before I sent the script over to Simon, I was close to disregarding it, reasoning that it must just be a lazy cash grab like all the other books on the case. But I gave it a go, on the off chance, and much to my surprise, what I found was a 232-page book, which is not far off pure primary sources, organized and annotated, ready for me to use. God damn, that's a good find, George. Turns out the Asahi Shimbun is a huge newspaper in Japan, and they always make these things for high-profile cases. Handy indeed. I'm sure I'll be delving into their bibliography for future scripts. Also, since a fair few of you have reached out to me to ask about this, let's begin discussing an even larger elephant that's been lingering the room during my last few scripts here on Casual Criminalist. What's been lingering? And that being what the hell happened to the Hong Kong videos. As indeed, as I said on the last script, which covered Supo Ko, if I recall correctly, I wasn't exactly going to be running out of material anytime soon. So what gives? Yeah, we used to get a lot more Hong Kong stuff from George. Well, put it this way, unbeknown to me, since my last visit to Hong Kong, a situation was brewing in the shadows. I won't say exactly what the situation is, as I wish to see it resolved promptly, amicably, and above all else, subtly for all parties involved, but whatever it was, it has rendered me completely incapable of producing Hong Kong scripts to a standard which I'm happy, so they have to be put mothballed for the foreseeable future. I kind of know what this is, and I'm not going to comment because, speaking of respecting privacy, I will respect George's. I also know full well that there are people watching or listening to this with the ability to solve this situation, and again, in the interest of trying to remedy the situation subtly, I shall not say to whom I refer, but they will know exactly who they are. And to them, I would wish to speak to them frankly and say that if they are being completely honest with themselves, they would have to admit that this situation, whatever it is rather nonsensical and has no reason to continue. What is going on? So let's get it fixed, people. We can all move forwards without both our dirty laundry having to be aired publicly. Oh my, and because I don't exactly wish to give away key details, at least not until I get to the point of having nothing left to lose, should the mystery people to whom I refer wish to know my opinion on an interpretation of the matter in more depth, I would refer them to the communication sent to them by Chief Executive Lee's office, the Chief Executive being Hong Kong's Prime Minister and President's equivalent for those of you in the audience not in the know in August 2024. George, what is going on in your life? And to the rest of the audience... everybody else. Many thanks for sitting through this no doubt very bizarre sounding and cryptic appendix. God willing, this will be all we ever have to say on the matter, and we can get back to telling heroic and gallant stories about the Hong Kong police force soon enough. And if we can't, well, put it this way, the dismembered appendices on my next episode are going to be wild. And that's where we end today's episode. Thanks for being here. George, what are you up to?